Okay, welcome to our quarterly technical exchange webinar for our Jacobs Pipeline Condition Assessment and Rehabilitation Services Community of Practice. This quarter will be our summer presentation. The presenters today are myself, talking about our rehabilitation project, and Dan Hegwold will be talking about our CARS field services. Before I get started, I wanted to share quick to everybody that we've moved to a new platform for these. You're still watching this through MS Teams, but to get your PDH credits, be sure to enroll for the course through Net Dimensions. So just a quick announcement, Jacobs has moved to this Net Dimensions platform for all of the training that the COPs are doing. It's very similar to some of the onboarding training that you guys did or likely have done. And what that means is that a recording of this webinar will be posted in that portal. You can get to Net Dimensions through the Jacobs Connect website, and you can view the recording on demand. And then get PDHs for it on demand as well. So for our practitioners who aren't able to join this actual call, they can always go and find the course through Net Dimensions, watch it, and then collect their PDHs afterwards. In this day and age, I think that's a great new feature. And so I just wanted to share that with folks in case they have to drop off or want to come back. There's still an opportunity for you to watch the full webinar in its entirety and earn PDHs later on. So with that being said, we'll go ahead and get started with this first half of the webinar. So the title of this project or case study was Alternative Delivery Enables a Slip Burst Ram Project for 72-inch Pipeline Rehabilitation. And so I'll be talking about that, explaining what we mean, but this was a fun project to do and kind of the first of its kind that we got to do for this customer. So quick background, our agenda will be talking about some background of the project. We'll go through the condition assessment of the pipeline and what drove us to the rehabilitation need. Talk about alternatives analysis. We'll explain the CMGC alternative delivery model that we ended up following. Talk a little bit about the technical details for rehabilitation design, show some eye candy for construction, and then move into lessons learned. So the Incline Creek Culvert is our subject here. It's about 2,000 feet of 72-inch corrugated metal pipe. It's a stream. It was a stream culvert. So we don't have exact records, but I believe it was installed in the 1970s. And you can see the alignment here, kind of from a perspective. Top side, the culvert, the full culvert alignment is shown in that yellow line there. It's all buried. You can see a couple of photographs. One at the bottom of the screen there shows what the entrance to the culvert looks like. You can see how deep it is, the embankment on top of it. And then that picture in the upper right shows kind of the ski lodge that's been built on top of it, and the culvert passes alongside and underneath it. Our understanding is the most probable construction method was that this was a creek that they just rolled the CMP into and then bulldozed over, kind of caved in the sides of the creek on top of it, which is probably one of the reasons that led to its observed condition and need for rehab. So as you can see, it passes under a ski lodge, chairlift towers, and access roads. And we first got involved in this project in 2011, and we actually saw invert erosion, very common, buckled sections, extreme ovality, and trench piping, that's the term used to say that fine materials are eroded from the outside of the pipe, and they erode that haunch support and get carried away by the waste stream. And then even in 2017, sinkholes and failures appeared, which accelerated the schedule for renewal and moved into condition assessment. I do see a couple hands raised. We'll have time for questions at the end, but just to make sure that I can get through all the content, and since this is being recorded, we can always come back and ask questions as we move along. So the full recording will be available for the team. So some pictures of the initial CCTV investigation. You can see buckled sections with reverse curvature, some oblique ovality. This is what I meant by one of those results of just caving in the side of the trench and kind of deforming the pipe. We see invert erosion.
Hey Dan, this is Rajat. We can't see the screen.
No. Can anybody on the call see the screen right now?
Dan, this is Kenny. I can see it.
Yes, sir. Yep.
Yes. Okay. So what I'm going to do, I apologize if people can't see the screen. The whole meeting is being recorded, so I do apologize. I would totally understand if you wish to drop off since you can't see it and view the recording later. But I'm aware that this sometimes happens with Teams, but it's not something that I fix. It's more of a tech support issue. This has happened on some of the other practice calls before. So So I'll go ahead and keep rolling, and like I said, it is recorded, so you will be able to watch all of it later on demand as you'd like. So this other photograph that I have here in the bottom left shows invert erosion with soil piping. So you can see where actually the bottom of the culvert was scraped away, right, and then that soil support was eroded and washed away. And then the picture on the lower right is an isolated lifted portion. So that's where we've actually got pieces of it that get that got either lifted up and broken away from the invert. So a problem with the culvert there. So this was characterized, something that I want to share with our practice, unlike reinforced concrete pipe or other flexible pipes, CMP can actually deflect a lot before it buckles. I mean, even greater than much greater than 10% sometimes. So you don't necessarily have to worry about the ovality itself may not be a cause for immediate rehabilitation for CMP. If it buckles, it certainly does. But what this does do to you is when you do have that extreme mobility, then you kind of exceed your conventional rehab methods, because although the culvert might not be an immediate threat of collapsing on itself just due to ovality, there's very little that you can do to fix it and reimpart any structural strength. A lot of the rehab technologies need a certain amount of base ovality. Deflecting CMP likely indicates soil failure, right? It's a flexible pipe, which means that the pipe depends on the soil for support. And so if the pipe is failing, the soil has failed. And so geotechnical improvements are often going to be a part of a flexible pipe rehabilitation project. Invert fail in mild piping is common. There's a lot of published guidance that exists, very commoditized work to fix that invert erosion piece. And so, that's very common. But the buckling that we saw, right, where we got reverse curvature, the lifting where the bottom of the pipe is lifted up, and the crown deterioration is more complex. So technology selection and alternatives analysis, how are we going to fix this pipe? So I'm going to kind of march through the different technologies that we looked at and what included or precluded them or were challenges. So we looked at a slip lining, and a 3D LiDAR that we collected on this had multiple conflicts, right? So you can see clearly we had a cross-sectional conflict. We couldn't push through this. And also we had these bend angles that we wouldn't be able to push the sticks of pipe through, right, without needing to chop them up into very small segments so that we could lobster back through them and maintain the joint tolerance, which can be done, but is another risk. And there's also the challenge that the leading edge could get arrested on that undulating culvert of the corrugations or any of those lifted portions. So then we thought about liner plates. But that was precluded pretty early on, again, because of capacity reduction, but a lot of custom work. We had these buckled lobes that we'd have to clear out of the way for the liner plate, which would involve the process like what's called spiling here, which I mean is you can see is pretty intense. You've got to ram these shoring pieces in and then excavate out the buckled portion while you're supporting it, and then push liner plate through it. So that was really unfavorable as well. CIPP was technically viable, but inexpensive. There'd be a lot of accommodations we need to make. You can't put in a pre-buckled CIPP liner. Well, I guess you could, but it wouldn't do much for you. So we would need to at least fill in those lobes, right? So these areas, so that we had at least something that didn't have any reverse curvature. We could design it, here that you can see in this with this orange shape here. We could design a liner that could be thick enough and reinforced enough to be structural even with that funky shape. But we'd have to fill in these lobes. And there was also these risks of blowout during inversion, which I've misspelled in the slide here, and now it's memorialized because I kept talking about how this is recorded. But there's risk of a blowout during inversion with a great slope. When you want to do a water inversion, that's a lot of hydrostatic head that you're putting at the end of that liner. So we'd have to do multiple insertion points so that we weren't putting that much head on the liner when we inverted it. And if we were going to do that, then we'd have to, if we wanted to move to air, then we'd still have to do multiple shots, because air shots are limited to what can be shipped in a refrigerated truck. And so then weight limits restrict on the highway, restrict how much they can ship. And then we also would still have to have non-styrenated resin. This project is located outside of Lake Tahoe, which is the most heavily regulated location in the universe. And so we'd have to use the green resin option, which would require a lot more air monitoring, treatment, capture, and disposal. So shotcrete was another one we looked at. It was the most versatile of the options. I mean, you're basically creating a reinforced concrete pipe, so the design can be pretty robust, and it arrives to the site in a bucket. But there was definitely a labor-intensive portion of this. It requires rigorous field QC and safety protocols to make sure that you get that what you're designing is actually what gets installed. And it's a time-intensive installation, but it does present the lowest risk to the owner in terms of a lot of this risk is then turned over to the contractor, right? It becomes their burden to make sure that it's designed as specified, and the risk is really borne by them. So forgive the obvious statement here, but our takeaway here is that all alternatives here presented significant risks for them. So for our case, the path to alternative delivery, I've got this kind of cute roadmap here showing the road here goes up to deciding if you want to do alternative delivery or if you take an off-ramp and go into conventional design bid build land. So first, if you have a prudent design, so engineering prudent from an engineering standpoint, so it's been tried and true, and it's fit for low bidding, almost, closer to commodity work, then you're in a design bid build situation. But if you need an innovative or cost saving design or a time savings design that you need a specific contractor commitment to make it work, you're probably still on the road for alternative delivery. The next kind of off-ramp is if your schedule is going to allow for a complete design and bidding phase where you think through all of the steps, you got to think through bidding strategy, put it out to bid, let the contractor prepare a response, all that needs to happen sequentially. If you have time, then it's probably another fit for a design bid build. If not, if you got a compressed schedule, and in this case we did for our project, they've got a very narrow construction window to accommodate basically between recreation seasons and heavy snows in Tahoe, then alternative delivery still looks appealing. And the last one is if you have an established and familiar contractor pool, you have to have the builders available who can actually do this work, right? And so if you've got many to pick from, you could be a good fit for design bid build. If not, if you're talking about a new or specialized technology or non-local providers, then you may want to look at alternative delivery to make sure that you get a qualified bidder. So in this case, we went through a CMGC contracting method, right? So after looking at all those technologies and realizing none of them were really ideal, we wanted to work with a contractor to pick which would be the most successful. Incline Village was our client. We had a contract line directly with them. We were going to be their engineer. We put out a bid, and then Q&D was interviewed by both us, by Jacobs and Incline Village. So we received packages from this contractor, interviewed them, and selected them. But Q&D's contract is directly to Incline Village. So there's no contract between us and Q&D. There's a dotted line. We're collaborating the whole time, but there's no hard contractual relationship between the two. So here's how we saw it worked on paper. This is again kind of restating that Richard Scarry cartoon. We designed something to a 30% level, outlining the alternatives and the requirements, put that out for advertisement. Contractors bid on it, and they would provide qualifications, approach, and then their estimated price with markups. You select them and you collaborate on the engineering and construction costs, and then you distribute risks and associated costs. And I'll talk about that in a minute. That's kind of an important part of this, this delivery method. Then you negotiate the final contract, including your key subs, right? So this is not something that the contractor doesn't take the bid and then go find subs to do it. Those key subs are identified ahead of time and a guaranteed maximum price. And then you execute and construct. You've got an open book schedule and earned value tracking. So that's that transparency that you have insight into throughout the project. So here I'm going to get into the technology piece of this, and this was a solution that the contractors proposed, and our role on the project was, to make sure that what they were proposing was, if they could do it, would it meet our engineering requirements, right? And so the arrangement here was that the contractor had the risk to make sure that this worked, and since they were proposing it and we were talking about it, it wouldn't be something that would fall back on Jacobs to say, well, you designed this, it wasn't possible. Well, no, the contractor said they could do this and wanted to know would it meet the requirements. So here's a cartoon that illustrates what they proposed. So I've got a profile here of the pipeline. So here is our conduit, and this is the embankment that's on top of it, and then it tapers out a little bit here. Then here's that large void. We had multiple of these, but here's probably the largest one that caused that buckled section in the culvert. So first was digging an excavation shaft outside the area of deepest embankment or an insertion pit. And then they would load in sticks of steel pipe, right? They'd load in a jacking frame. The red thing is a slip line jacking frame. And then they would drop in sticks of steel pipe, and they had welded on a conical head attachment on the front, kind of like a bursting head to re-round and also keep the pipe from hitting those obstructions that were on the bottom, but to lift it up and let it ride on top of the undulations. And then they would advance the pipe through the area portions that it could with the jacking frame. So they'd start just slip lining it. So it's slip lining, right? Part of the slip burst ram. But then if the forces that they encountered when they came to this buckled section were too great, they would load in a pipe ram. So if you're familiar, a pipe ram is usually used for new trenchless installations. It's an extremely powerful machine that does what it says. It rams the pipe and usually is meant to ram it through total soil. In this case, we're ramming it through an obstruction here with an attempt to re-round past the section. So the pipe ram will literally force it through out the other end, and push this soil up. Then after the fact, we would come back in and grout the annulus, and then we would drill grouting ports and do soil grouting on the outside to fill that grout, right? We still need to address that void that's there, and then come back in and do a cementitious lining on the entire thing for corrosion protection. So this has never been done before, and this is not something that we typically as an engineer would say, yes, contractor, go do something that's never been done before. There's a whole pantheon of liability that's invoked by that. But what's unique about this procurement method is that this was something that the contractor brought forward, and so the risk was on them to make sure that this could succeed. And our role was to evaluate and and help them identify, well, have they characterized the geotech enough? Would this steel pipe, is it thick enough, and would the cement be enough for corrosion protection after the pipe was installed? So here's how you handle risks in this kind of delivery method. So, there's the uncertainties in the construction approaches. There's productivity rates, right, that might be affected by wind, weather, or weather and other things. Site conditions, things that you may or may not have characterized as detailed as you like or could, and then extra work. Things always come up, right? You quantify those risks, both in terms of probability and cost. We do this all the time from a condition assessment standpoint. In this context, you do it from a construction standpoint. What's the probability and the cost of all these risks? And then you balance the risk tolerance between all parties, right? You evaluate the risk versus the reward or the price. And then you've got owner-controlled versus contractor-controlled allocations. So these are things where, if certain risks are encountered, the owner gets to arbitrate whether or not the contractor can dip into those risk monies to resolve it. And other things are the things that the contractor says that they're going to be able to control and say, they're going to be the ones that make the determination. And then you set aside these weighted contingency budgets for the remaining risks. So here's what I'll share. This is an example, and I've even got watermarked on the back. It says big example there. And what I want to point out here is this is that transparency piece. I can't share with you what our actual risk register was for this project. That was one of the things that was confidential because there's a lot of insight into how that contractor is set up. And so there's just a risk that if that could be made to their competitors, that they could then be, tactfully outbid in projects. But what I can share with you is that these risks, the scale, what I've listed here on the left-hand column, that's exactly the type of risk that was talked about. What's the risk of a bypass overflow? What's the risk that you might actually need internal spiling? What at the time there were tariffs that were going on? What's the risk that that steel costs would go up? And these are, the potential costs here. These are not the ones from the project, but they're about the right order of magnitude. There were many risks that were identified, and they're all given scales, in this magnitude: 10,000, 90,000, 50,000, and then a probability, right? An estimated probability that's agreed upon, and then a weighted contingency. So those are the weighted contingencies, cost times probability, that go off into a special war chest that can be tapped by the contractor or the owner, depending on the circumstances as the project evolves. So with that, armed with this delivery method, here we're getting to the eye candy of the construction. So the first thing they did was bypass the culvert. They used rubber dams. You can kind of see them here, but they redirected the culvert through HDPE pipe. They put these rubber dams in and then an HDPE pipe that pumped the water around. And then here's the downstream end. You can see that they've got a diffuser that comes up and then the water poured out. And so that's the downstream end of the culvert. They dug the insertion pit, so you can see they went to the one open area that they did have access to, put in the trench boxes and bedding. And then here's the welding of the rounding head under the top. You can see it's got this conical shape here to re-round, and then it's reinforced on the inside.
We can't see what you're presenting.
Yeah, so I've heard this is an issue before with Teams. What I can just offer is that if you can't see it, it is all being recorded, and I apologize. It's a Teams limitation. I've heard of this happening, but the content is shared and is recorded. So thanks for sharing, and I'll have to work through TAC to see how we can get that problem fixed. So here's the attachment of the rounding head. In the lower left-hand screen, you can see you can barely see it out in the shadow here, but I want to show that there was bracing that they actually welded in. So to make sure that this rounding head, because it was going to see some pretty hard stresses, the rounding head wouldn't get buckled and compromised. And then, using a crane and lifting and putting the lead pipe into the trench. Here's the operation of the jackring frame, just like a regular slip lining operation, and completing of the first insertion. And now, as they drop in each new steel sticks of pipe, they had to do welds, and we did complete joint penetration welds. So it took a while to get that kind of welding done on each of the sticks, but it was important, right? You did not want these sticks getting separated inside the trench when they were seeing that much resistant force. And then success, right? The rounding head emerged at the downstream end. You can see, some of the scrape marks here, but overall, the bracing did its job of re-rounding the pipe and getting the steel through. What I also want to mention is that not only was there a re-rounding issue, but this alignment wasn't straight. I showed those bends and curves. So they weren't just re-rounding it from a cross-sectional point of view. They were kind of straightening the pipe as they ran this steel pipe through. So that was the other thing that's important to take note of. And then we did the annular space grouting. So they drilled holes, they did grout injection, and then afterwards they prepped the surface and went through with a centrifugally applied cementitious liner for corrosion protection on the inside. So my lessons learned here, the CMGC model really enabled innovations that would otherwise impart too much risk, primarily to the owner, and too much risk to us as the engineer, that you might see if you wanted to go in a conventional low bid process. Doing something that was the first of its kind ever, and would essentially put, this, if we were to design this and say, do this first of a kind burst split ram and put a steel pipe through a collapsed and curved section, I mean, if we were to put out a specification like that, that's a ton of risk on us, right? The contractor could say, I did what you said and it didn't work. But the CMGC model really put that risk back on the contractor if they felt that they could get it and get a savings, and then could reward them, right? This project saved over $1 million compared to the other alternatives, and the contractor could share in that. The open book costing and scheduling is confidential outside the parties involved. So everybody that's on the job, you have a view of, you can be assured of transparency, but it may complicate value comparisons between your other regions or projects, especially when it comes to us as consultants who have a hand in it. Because this is confidential, we can't. It's not always an easy one-to-one to say, is CMGC the right model to use, because some of this financial information is confidential. And then from a technical standpoint, this was a great project. It worked out well, but I just want to say that, you're not going to see a master spec for this kind of approach showing up in our library anytime soon. I think there's a lot more research needed to see, what are the limits of this approach, right? For re-rounding buckled and curved alignments. And we used a pretty stout steel pipe. Did we need to, right? More research to see could there even be a potentially thinner steel shells or casings that could be re-rounded by this approach. So with that, I think I've got 4 minutes for questions. Again, I apologize for those who can't see the screen. Say again, it is recorded, so we can always go back and look. But I got a few minutes for questions before I turn it over to.
Hello, I'm Susan Moisey. I'm the Global Solutions Director for Conveyance and Storage for Jacobs as part of the water market. And we're delighted that you have joined us today for our webinar. This is a series of webinars that we have about hot topics, and today's webinar is AI for AI, and it is about aging infrastructure and corrosion control. So what does aging infrastructure mean to us in the water market, and why is this an important hot topic? Well, when the COVID virus started and the directive came down to simply start with washing your hands, my mother, who is a retired nurse practitioner, had a I told you so moment for all of us in the family. But you know what? You can't wash your hands if you cannot get the water to the tap. And that's why aging infrastructure is so important to us. And it's why keeping your water distribution assets and your sewer assets in good working order are so important to us. When we picked the topic today, I challenged my team, and my team on here are Dan Buonadonna, who is the Global Technology Lead for Condition Assessment and Rehabilitation Services, and Jerome Griffin, who is the Global Technology Lead for Corrosion Control. I challenged them to go in two directions. I challenged Dan B to talk about innovation and start a conversation about where could you take this artificial intelligence and how it impacts us in the water industry. And then I challenged Jerome to go in a different direction. I challenged Jerome to give us the very basics of corrosion control. And I did this for two reasons. Number one, I've been that young engineer right out of college who was tasked with reviewing all of the CCTV tapes that came in to our district. And I know what a game changer it is when we can take artificial intelligence and we can apply it to aging infrastructure, not only from the speed of what we're doing, but from the accuracy. And then I think from an industry standpoint, I think we wait too long to bring in the corrosion control experts. We wait until we have a problem and then we bring them in. So I think it's important to look at this from that standpoint. And I'm just simply delighted that we have two industry experts with us today. We have Sam Sloan from United Utilities, Drainage Area Manager from the UK, and we have Viviana Torres Ortiz, who is a Senior Project Manager from Fort Lauderdale. So the way that all of this is going to tie in together, Sam is going to start, and she's going to start and talk about the challenge. She's going to talk about the challenge of being a utility manager with aging infrastructure and how does she manage that. Then Dan B is going to move into innovation. He's going to talk about artificial intelligence and how we are pulling that in to our aging infrastructure platform. And then we're going to move over to Viviana. And Viviana is going to talk about the challenge again of working in a utility with some corrosion issues. And then we're going to finish up with Jerome, who's going to talk about very basic corrosion control. How do you understand it? And how do we get us to a point where we can keep our water infrastructure assets up and running? So a little bit of housekeeping information. So we're going to have a couple of polling questions, and we ask you please to participate in those polling questions, and then post your questions in the question box. And then at the end of all of the four speakers, then we'll have the questions. PDHs are available for those of you who need them, and they're available as part of the live webinar. And I think that gets us going from the housekeeping items, and I'm going to turn it over to Sam to get started.
Thank you. Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us. I'm Sam Sloan, and I'm a Drainage Area Manager for the United Utilities, and that's a water and wastewater sewerage company in the northwest of England. So as discussed, today's webinar is really to cover off those technical advances in the horizon for sewer assessment and to meet the challenges associated with an aging sewer network. So to set the stage for this, I'm going to share some of the challenges that I face in the day-to-day operation of my business. So some quick facts, really, just for a bit of context for people who don't know much about the UK water industry. The sewerage systems began to be implemented in around mid-19th century, and the majority are assumed pre-1945. The United Utilities itself started in around 1995. We're the largest listed water company in the FTSE, serve around 7 million customers. And the environment that we operate in ranges from rural catchments to densely populated urban catchments with cities such as Manchester and Liverpool. And we've also got 5 of the 7 wettest areas in England and Wales. In addition to this, we've got one of the most deprived areas. So everything we think about always has to come back to our customers and the affordability as a key consideration. Okay, so on to the next slide then, the actual sewer network, the big picture. Our sector obviously faces a number of challenges, both now and as well as in the long term. And these exist due to the nature of the aging assets, their function, but also due to a number of external drivers. So population growth, as I said, we serve 7.2 million customers, but that's forecast to increase by another million in the next 20 odd years. Climate change, we know that our climate's going to change dramatically, and that's going to result in more frequent drought and more frequent occurrences of heavy rainfall. And for us, that's already a big challenge. Because only recently we've been simultaneously managing both at the same time. And then back in February of this year, we had the highest volume of rainfall that we've ever had on record here in the UK for that month. So in addition to those environmental challenges, we're a regulated industry. So every 5 years we go through a price review process, and we work with our regulator to ensure that we're getting the cheapest bills, providing the cheapest bills, and improving performance in all areas. So we're 4 months into that cycle at the minute, and we've committed to reduce bills by 10%, improve water quality in over 1,300 kilometres of rivers, reduce sewer collapses by 9%, and have 650 less flooding incidents per year, and the list goes on and on. So managing these challenges is a careful balancing act for us. So when we talk about sewer infrastructure asset management, we always need to bring it back to objective risk management, optimising our investment, always to strive towards improving performance. So on the next slide, a bit in more detail about the UU sewer network specifically. We've got around 77,000 kilometres of sewers, and that's just the sewers that we know of. The majority of those assets are assumed to be pre-1945. And if you look at the chart on the right, you can see the distribution of age, and it's far shy in terms of that 77,000 that I just said. And that's because we've only got age data on about half of our network. And this is mainly down to the poor transfer of asset data records when we went through a period of privatisation in the late 80s, early 90s. It's also because we have a lot of transferred sewers, and these are private sewers and lateral drains that were transferred into our ownership around 10 years ago. And again, when they were transferred, we didn't get the records to go with them. So big data problem. And then in terms of the function of the network, half of it is combined. So it means we're extremely susceptible to the impact of rainfall and climate change, like I spoke about. The most common material is vitrified clay, and that's obviously susceptible to root intrusion and cracks, as we know. But all of these characteristics need to be treated with caution, because 50% of our attributes are inferred. So we know that again contributes to the data challenge. So we've got an extensive asset base, 77,000 kilometres, but a big data challenge. Then on to the next slide. How do we effectively manage the risk of that asset base then with the challenge around data? We've got a first-time resolution model, so that drives the first-time fixes by our teams as we give them a fully equipped CityFlex unit. So that means they have mainline CCTV on the unit, they've got jetting available on the unit to make sure we do a thorough investigation. Currently, we only use that CCTV for that investigation and for capturing images of defects to pass on to our further works team. Our further works teams then, they work on quick SLAs, do mostly civils repairs, patch repairs and lining, normally around 7,000 jobs a year. In addition to that, our model also incorporates a comprehensive data capture process because we're trying to stabilise that position and improve the position on data. And that updates our corporate systems after every job and informs our plan programme. The figure below then shows the change in our plan programme. We have a mature DSILT programme now with a good understanding of the rate of build-up, which has enabled us to carry out frequency optimisation. The routine removal of roots as well, where they can lead to incidents, has also led to a reduced requirement for root cutting because of us dealing with our legacy issues over the years. Then we've got a risk-based capital investment programme, so we combine all of that data to produce an annualised risk factor to optimise our investment. So that uses historic incident data combined with deterioration modelling to forecast our change in risk. However, you only know what you know, and that's kind of why this topic is so important at the minute. We're still dependent on customers telling us when things go wrong due to that knowledge gap and due to that gap on the knowledge about the asset condition across our full sewer network. So we need to be able to capture and code CCTV data more widely to get that greater coverage, but also bringing it back to the original considerations, keeping it affordable so that we can maximise our investment. Currently, we're only getting visibility of 1% of our sewer network, and that takes around 200 of our staff. So next slide, performance impact then. So what does that mean for us in terms of our regulators? So what I covered at the start, the characteristics we discussed pose a big challenge there. So the main cause of both pollution and flooding in an average year for us is due to blockages and sewer defects. 70% of our pollutions and 60% of our flooders. And as discussed, the reduction in these events is primarily through us doing thorough investigation, root cause analysis to prevent the repeat incidents. And over the years, we've successfully reduced that number. So now we're in a space where our bigger challenge is how do we get ahead of those first time incidents? And for that, we need more visibility of the condition of our expansive sewer network. Then on the last slide, just to wrap it up, we can't deliver the performance targets continuing with our traditional approaches for sewer condition assessment. We can't do it with our normal operations and maintenance procedures. We need that significant step change. So our ambition is to think smarter, it's to work more efficiently, it's to harness the data and digital advancements, increase the capture and categorization of that condition data, increase sensing capability to identify performance risks, and make the most of the data that we've already got available, so the abundance of that fast-pass reactive CCTV data. So the drive and the appetite for harnessing the data is there, and the digital advancements is there, but we're not blind, because we know that that in itself comes with its own challenges. Data quality, user adoption of technology, and all the culture change that comes with it as well. But this is the step change that we need for United Utilities, but also for the UK water industry and internationally. That's the step change that we need to deliver on the ever-increasing performance targets. That's me. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Sam. Excellent. A couple of takeaways there. You only know what you know. I like that. And the 1% of their assets that they are inspecting. So that transitions us nicely into Dan Buonadonna, who's going to talk about innovations in artificial intelligence for sewer asset management. Take it away, Dan.
Thank you very much, Susan, and thanks everybody for joining again. So on the next slide, we're going to talk about artificial intelligence for helping utilities, just like the ones that Sam just described, to tackle the challenges of aging infrastructure. And when we look at what the cost of that, sewer O&M is a $50 billion a year government expenditure in North America, right? And so that's the number that's associated with just taking care of the pipes and the infrastructure in the ground. And that totals up to about $750,000 of public sewer, $500,000 of private sewer, which is like going back and forth to the moon 6 or 7 times. And as Sam just walked through, CCTVing, inspecting, and just trying to understand that information for 1% of that system produces over 1,500 days worth of solid video, which currently must be viewed by a human being in order to provide those utility managers with usable information. So on the next slide, we talk about it's little wonder that this industry is about over $100 billion behind schedule in trying to keep up with the issues of aging infrastructure. And an off-cited report card by the ASCE has cited the wastewater infrastructure in the neighborhood of a D+, right, for its current status. And a WRF study in 2012 did a survey to see what are the major obstacles that the industry faces. And high on the list were funding, a lack of technical deficiency, a need of time and personnel, or the absence of a strategy to try and help tackle this. So on the next slide, we're going to talk about how there are 2 main aspects that artificial intelligence is helping to address some of these challenges. One, we're going to talk about how can we use artificial intelligence to more cost effectively harvest the data that's out there that our inspectors are collecting. And then later on, we're going to talk about how artificial intelligence can help us analyze it. When we talk about automated sewer CCTV defect coding, the case study we're going to walk through is a collaboration right now between Jacobs and Hitachi for an artificially intelligence-driven prototype to review CCTV and code the defects that it sees automatically. So to frame this up a little bit on the next slide,
And we just talked about how the status quo for CCTV condition assessment, it can't keep up. And many cities have active CCTV programs, but they still find that they don't have the personnel to focus on the defect coding, or the methods that they're currently using for defect coding are technically deficient. They're not getting the richness of the data that they want. And it's disproportionate, the amount of time it takes to collect and analyze this data or to collect the data to the value that it brings. If we look at the lifespan of 1,000 feet worth of sewer video, on average, it takes between 2 to 6 hours, or 30 to 40% of the total acquisition time just spent defect coding. So on the next slide, we'll walk through what that looks like. A CCTV inspector, when they get out there, what they have to worry about, they have to worry about mobilizing, finding the manholes, setting up traffic control, staying safe, cleaning the pipe, doing the inspection, and then defect coding. So 30 to 40% of this total time is them sitting in front of a computer screen wanting to make sure that the crack is actually a crack. The grease is actually a grease blob. Is that a rock, or is that gravel? And that doesn't even count all the robot repairs they have to do, demobilization, emergency communications. So you can see they're spending the biggest chunk of their time in all of these things just doing defect coding. So artificial intelligence is to close the gap and help shrink that amount of time that's spent there. So on the next slide, we'll talk about how, why has artificial intelligence come to the sewer, and how prior efforts have tried to close that gap before. So in the past, standard protocols have been introduced to try and reduce bias. But as you can see here on the slide, the majority of the data is still heavily skewed. So on the graph there on the left, you can see a pie chart that shows, when they went through and looked at how many different types of inspectors had inspected the same pipe, the majority of them, even though they're looking at the same information, had given it a different coding system. In the next bullet here, we talk about the next improvement that was made. Image mapping software programs worked in theory. So these are computer programs that had large libraries of defects, but when they tried to match one particular defect with one that was seen in the video, the software was simply bogged down, and they couldn't automate the process without a huge library. And the third attempt was multi-sensor inspection platform. So as you can see here, this is one of the first tools that was introduced in the market maybe in the 1970s, and it collects different types of data now. We're talking about laser and sonar to try and help inform and understand the condition, but they're time consuming and they are diameter limited. And then the next one shows a practical limitation that we have in the industry. So, most legacy CCTV data has the resolution of about one of those classic Motorola Razr phones has, which can be difficult for human inspectors to view and analyze and understand. So the next slide, we'll talk about some of or actually pause, we'll take a polling question and see, so if that's where the industry was currently with the need for humans coding CCTV data, what would you as a industry practitioner expect if this could be automated? What kind of level of accuracy would you expect? Consider that it would be both consistent and complete, and kind of different grade ratings there. I'll pause and just give us maybe 10 seconds or so to respond. Okay, we go ahead and see some results. All right, so I appreciate good results. Looks like the majority of people expected, the software to get an A, but also, I guess if we count up the majority of the total participants, kind of the B and C range would be what people would expect. Well, let's look at what some of the prototype results were and compare it to those. So on the screen here, you're seeing we're peeking under the hood of one of the prototype results. So this was a prototype that was developed in a short period of time using artificial intelligence. And what you're looking at is a classic pipe graph. This would be like if you took a pipe inspection, slid it along the top and unfolded it so you looked at the whole pipe wall. On the x-axis is the footage, the distance alongside the pipe, and on the y-axis is the clock position. The blue dots are the human observations. So this is what somebody who was trained in coding protocols went and observed in the pipeline. And the orange dots are the machine prediction, and the size and depth of color of the machine prediction corresponds to its confidence, right? Machines produce a confidence level with all of their assets. And what we see here is good agreement, right? We see good agreement between the control blue dots and the large orange dark colored dots are what the machine predicted. And we see them clustered around the same defects. If we were to look at this analytically, this is well over 90% or in the A range of accuracy. On the next slide, we look at, if we take it from just one pipe and look at a whole system, 100 or 1,000 pipes, and we want to look at how those condition grades would come out, right? So if we look at all the different defects together and how would things score from good, fair, and poor, we can compare the human group on the left to the machine group on the right. And again, we're in that plus 90% accuracy range, with the machine group being a little more conservative on what would be rated as a fair or poor pipe. Next slide, please. So how will this help? You know, we're talking about using machines to get more complete data. You know, the machine never blinks. We talk about using machines to get more consistent data. The machine would not be biased, and it would, every time that it would look at the same video, it would be consulting it, it would be reviewing it under the same set of information, the same eyes that it has with all the other videos. And it's much faster. Machines do not fatigue, machines do not get bored, and we can process, you know, terabytes of data in a fraction of the time. And for anybody who's been out there collecting sewer CCTV data, you know, they know that just deploying those robots is challenging enough. And this is an effort to be able to leave that data cataloging task to the machines. Next, please. So the second half of the presentation is going to be talking about how artificial intelligence can then be applied to analyzing that data that comes out of these sewer CCTV trucks, particularly to optimize service life predictions and maintenance. So if we look at the other two challenges, insufficient funding and a lack of a strategy, studies have shown that a 10% increase in the accuracy of structural remaining useful life, or O&M frequencies, can increase or can reduce the life cycle costs up to about 25%. So on the next slide, we'll talk about where the industry currently has been trying to address O&M optimization and RUL prediction. It's by using condition decay curves, by forcing curves through data like you see on the right here. You know, that's an example of an attempted correlation between pipe age and a condition score, and you can see the difficulties in trying to get a nice clean curve fit. Other predictive models have tried to use tree logic, a series of if-then statements, but those can be very time-consuming and complex to develop and can even only map a few variables. And all of this has been to answer questions like, when will the pipe fail, how will it fail, and what's the best way to prevent it? So on the next slide, we'll talk about what makes machine learning different. So we talked about standard regression curves like what's on the left, and on the right shows how a deep neural network works. And maybe one of the ways I can explain this is, if we can all visualize a two-dimensional regression line, y equals mx plus b, well, imagine if you could do that in 3 dimensions. You had 3 sets of data that you could try to fit a curve to. Well, it's kind of hard to visualize what that might look like, but what if we had 4 dimensions, or 5 dimensions, or 100, or 1,000, right? And you had individual curve fits for each of those. That's kind of an analogy to how the machine learning aspect can do that regression process, find patterns, and predict outcomes without being explicitly programmed. So the next slide, we can kind of peek under the hood about what some of these prototype results look like. So this is, again, an AI-driven engine that looked at CCTV condition data from pipes to predict what its remaining useful life would be. On the x-axis is time. That's a measure of time between different inspections. On the y-axis is a measure of score. The dots on the far left are the initial inspection that was done by a human. And then the lines that protrude from those are what the machine would predict based on that unique combination of scores and asset information. And those are, you can see each of those remaining useful life curves is different. And on the dots on the far right, those are the second inspections that a human performed. And you can see good agreement between, in some cases, you know, the machine predicted the score dead on, and others, the margin of error was still fairly small. So we're seeing already, you know, plus 90% accuracy of these tools. On the next slide, you can see there's still some work to be done. You know, garbage in equals garbage out. And so there are still some predictions where, you know, we weren't, the AI engine doesn't hit the mark exactly, but a large part of that has to do with the accuracy and quality of the data collected originally, which is what we talked about before. So on the next slide, you know, if you want to see what this looks like overall, and you look at hundreds or thousands of data points, you know, the old way on the left, that's what try to match curve you could be. You can see an R-squared value, which is an approximation for accuracy of negative, you know, 1.8. And even these initial prototypes of AI and machine learning give R-squared values north of 0.81. You can see there on the right, much stronger correlation between what, you know, 2 humans from 2 different inspection scores looked at versus what a machine would predict looking at just 1 inspection. So how will this help in the end, the long run? This next slide talks about what this could mean for decision making. 2 different pipes, very different materials with different defects. You know, the old way might get the same score, and in these risk-based asset management frameworks might get categorized with the same RUL and the same rehab. But AI now lets us really parse those 2 out and suss out how the 2 different defects, the 2 different materials may have very different remaining useful lives and have a specific remaining useful life or optimized maintenance program for each of them. It also allows us to build in strong localized predictors, right, that maybe weren't cost effective to build in before. We can look at things like the installing contractors, specific manufacturer of pipes, or other inputs that are really strong predictors for optimizing service. And with that, I'll say thanks again and turn it over to the next presenter.
All right, thank you so much, Dan B. How far we have come and how far we can go. All right, we're going to turn it over to Viviana from the city of Fort Lauderdale, and she's going to talk to us about the challenges of managing her system and then leading into corrosion control. Take it away.
Well, good morning all. So as Susan was saying, I work for the city of Fort Lauderdale and under the Public Works Department in Engineering Division, and specifically under the Consent Order Program. So the city of Fort Lauderdale was incorporated in 1911, and we are the largest city in Broward County and among the 10 largest cities in Florida. We serve many residential, commercial buildings, neighborhoods, and new developments, and we get tourists year-round. Among others, our Public Works Department provides drinking water, treatment and distribution, and wastewater collection and treatment. Next slide. Our collection system has an extension area, service area of 38 square miles and includes gravity and force mains and approximately 177 pump stations. And within our system, we have 111 miles of force mains. As a result of the challenges we have with aging infrastructure, in 2017, the city entered into a consent order with the Florida Department of the Environmental Protection, which among others is focused on improvements to our collection and transmission system, mainly focusing on force mains replacements and rehabilitation. Next slide. So one of the requirements of this consent order is that the city had to complete a force main condition assessment, and the condition assessment goals in the case of our city was to determine the risk criteria that were more critical for our city operations. So our operations staff and the engineering folks, and we all came up with some criteria with the help of Jacobs, and we score and give weight to those criteria. And another goal we had is that we wanted to create a baseline on how to plan capital improvements. We also wanted to focus our operation and the planning to be based on risk mitigation, so lowering the risk of our infrastructure of failing. So Fort Lauderdale decided to move from a reactive operation to a more proactive operation. So first, in the condition assessment, the risk analysis was developed on all active miles of force mains. So Jacobs developed and applied a risk matrix similar to the one is shown here on the left to determine a tier condition assessment approach. So based on the risk score, the high risk pipes were moved into projects right away, either under our consent order or other to our community investment plan. And the really low risk pipes, we move it to our asset management program and will be continued to be monitored. So in those pipes that were in the middle, from moderate to high risk pipes, which total 42 miles of active force mains, were determined to need a tier assessment, and the city chose to do a tier 1 assessment, and which included external corrosion study. Next slide. So in this slide, I wanted to present the risk matrix criteria that we used, which involve computing the likelihood of failure. And we have years since pipe installation, pipe material, pipe break information available from the city, force main operating pressures, pipe layout, external and internal factors affecting the asset, including proximity to brackish water, and pipe maintenance records, included tribal knowledge. So, and also we developed a criteria for the consequence of failure, and those included pipe diameter, proximity to water and residential, system reliability, financial impact, community impact, and environmental impacts. So we met with everyone in operations and everyone involved in making decisions in the city, and we weighted those criteria and we put which were more important for the city operation. And these scores were developed, as I say, doing the available information from the city. And the risk was computed by multiplying the likelihood of failure and the consequence of failure. And those 42 miles of formings identified to have a moderate to high risk are also metallic pipes. So external corrosion surveys were selected for the Tier 1 assessment, including soil resistivity and pipe to soil methodologies. So here in South Florida, we have unique challenges that leads to potential for internal and external corrosion. First, we have flat topography, which results in increased miles of pressure pipes and also increases the cost for this type of condition assessment. Second, we have manifolded and low pressure and less than full pipe operations. And finally, we have corrosion related to saltwater intrusion. So based on this Tier 1 assessment results that we did, approximately 7.1 miles of force mains were recommended to be included in our consent order program that will be completed. These are projects of replacement and rehabilitation that will be completed within the next 5 years. And approximately 13.1 miles of force main are recommended to be added to our CIP program for future rehabilitation and replacement. And we have projects coming along the way for those 13 miles. So in summary, this condition assessment allowed the city to move forward with improved proactive planning for our force main systems and be able to plan better for replacement and rehabilitation of our aging infrastructure. I will leave you now with Jerome.
Okay, hey, thank you, Viviana. Very interesting to see the challenges of managing a system in Florida, and especially from a corrosion standpoint. And Viviana talked about the tiered approach, and now I'm going to turn it over to Jerome, and he's gonna tie that in from a what does Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 mean, and then take it away.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you all for joining. I'll be discussing corrosion control basics in the water industry. Next slide. Let's start with a couple photos that shows minor corrosion. This is considered the good corrosion, if you will. On the left, you have some atmospheric corrosion that's taking place. This is typically general corrosion or uniform corrosion. And the photo on the right shows some galvanic corrosion. This is where two dissimilar metals were used and corrosion is taking place. So for now, this is considered the good. It will get increasingly worse as time goes on. Also, we have a couple photos of some moderate corrosion. So this is considered the bad. So the photo on the left has a couple locations where you see some corrosion nodules, and also you see some pitting on the shell of the carbon steel tank. And on the right, you have a similar corrosion nodule, but it is on stainless steel. So in this particular application, stainless steel is annealing, and it allowed that product to stay inside the pipe to give you that time to go inside and see if you can do a liner for that particular application. Next slide. So on this slide, you have severe corrosion. This is considered the ugly. So at the top left, you can see some through wall corrosion on a pipeline. The top center, you can see a well that used to be carbon steel, which is no longer there. On the right, you can see some rebar corrosion that has taken place from erosion corrosion. And also on the bottom, where there's a couple gloves in the photos, that used to be the roof of a carbon steel tank, which was found on the tank floor during the inspection. Next slide. So some things to consider for corrosion control. Think about that location in the environment. The photo on the right, you can see where a pipeline was installed in a right-of-way, and there's been growth on the right-of-way. That tree has damaged the coating on that asset, and the operator need to go in and repair that asset. So think ahead where you're going to install those assets. Understand why it makes that difference, so you can make sure you don't have any right-of-way concerns, and also look at the corrosion potential. As Viviana mentioned, risk equals likelihood times consequence. Next slide. So we use a tiered approach for assessing the condition of your assets. We use a tier 1, tier 2, and a tier 3. So with tier 1, it's above ground survey. Tier 2 is the excavation related survey, and tier 3 is the smart technology tools that Dan Bonadonna mentioned earlier. Next slide. So with the city of Fort Lauderdale, we use a tier 1 approach. We looked at the recent force main breaks. We went in and did a survey of the 42 miles of force main. We're focused on the exterior environment of those force mains to see how corrosive it was. So we took some soil resistivity readings and also took some pipe soil potentials, and we used that data to overlay it with the recent breaks that they had, and also to use it to identify hotspot locations and future areas that may have corrosion likelihood. Next slide. We also created a mobile app. This allowed us to input that data from those soil resistivity measurements, as well as the pipe of soil potentials. That allowed us to input that into that app, and we can upload that and show data in real time back in the office standpoint. Next slide. And this is some photos of the field measurements that were being captured. We have some accessible locations to take the pipe of soil potentials in a vault, also in the manhole. And the picture on the right shows the soil resistivity measurements being captured using the 4-pin Wiener method. Next slide. So tier 2. So with tier 2, you will need an accessible location. So you may have to excavate or pothole to get access to that structure. Within the excavation, you can capture ultrasonic thickness readings to see what that remaining wall thickness is on that asset. You can check to see if there's a coating present. You can measure the depths of any pits that may be found on that pipe surface. And also you can check the backfill. You can check for pH. You can send off the backfill for analysis, see what the chloride, sulfate content, redox potential may be within that backfill. And also you can check for groundwater. And as you can see in that picture on the left, at the bottom of the letter, there is some groundwater influence. And on the right, you can do a potholing. So if you can't do a backfill, you can do one behind a curb. Not a backfill, but an excavation. Do a pipe of soil measurement within the pothole area, whether it's behind a curb or in the street. You can see if the coating is present. For example, if your as-built doesn't show if you have a coating or not in that location. You can also pull that soil sample and take a soil resistivity measurement off of that or send it off for analysis. Next slide. And with tier 2, you can consider adding a test station. This can be a test station. If it's in the street, it could be a flush mounted at grade test station, or if it's behind a curb, you can do a post mounted test station. This allows you to take that pipe to soil potential measurement without having to excavate in the future. Next slide. In tier 3, so we had a client, San Francisco Public Utilities Commission. They used the MFL2 magnetic flux leakage tool that was inserted in their pipeline that allowed them to see what type of corrosion and wall loss they may have on their asset. This was whether it was external corrosion, internal corrosion. It also checked for any ovality issues such as dents, any gouges. It identified their joint locations and also manufacturing and anomaly defects within that asset. And using a smart tool like Dan B mentioned, it gives you that real-time information on your pipeline. Next slide. And this MFL2 that San Francisco used, it was for a pipeline that had a historical problem. These were mortar-lined steel pipes, some up to 80 years old. They were also able to identify those third-party damage areas, some that were known and unknown. And also they could identify locations where they may have did system modifications, past repairs. And using a smart tool, it gives you that option to decide whether you want to do a pipe replacement, pipe cutout, or just do immediate repairs as needed. Next slide. So I'll pause with a polling question. So what methods do you use to protect against corrosion to enhance the life of your infrastructure? I'll give you about 15 seconds to select one of these options. Okay, any results? Okay, looks like the majority of you all are using coatings and cathodic protection. Okay, so I'll go through and discuss each of these options now. Next slide. So how does corrosion occur? What's the science behind it? Well, I guess let me start by saying, like many of you, I didn't know what corrosion was. When I was a kid, I used to take all my toys apart and try to put them back together. I always wanted to fix things. I was always interested in electricity and electronics. So that background of electrical led me into corrosion. And now it's been over 20 years and I've been in corrosion and obtained several NACE and NASCO certifications. Next slide. So what is corrosion? Well, corrosion is a loss of material, and this is due to the reaction with its environment. So how corrosive is that area that you're placing this asset? And you may think that it's metals that's only affected with corrosion, but also non-metals are affected as well. Next slide. So corrosion, there's 4 parts that are needed. So if you remove one of these parts, corrosion cannot exist. You'll need an area such as an anode, which corrodes. You'll need a cathode. This is the structure that you're trying to protect. You'll need a pathway. This is the connection between both the anode and the cathode. And also you'll need electrolyte. So this is the submerged portion, whether it's in soil, water, or if there's moisture present. It can create that corrosion likelihood. Next slide, please. So how do you prevent corrosion? Well, the first line of defense is using those protective coatings for the exterior. With ductile iron pipe, in the past, the standard DIP with no coating, you were subject to how corrosive that environment was where you placed that asset. And also you were more prone to have stray current interference. Some of the barriers for coating options that were used in the past were the standard polyethylene encasements, which is known as polywraps, the polyethylene tapes, the polyurethanes, also FBE coatings. And some of the newer technologies uses a V-Bio polyethylene encasement, which is an enhanced polywrap. It has microbial protection. And you can also consider using zinc-coated ductile iron pipe as additional layer protection as well. Next slide. So with welded steel pipe, some of the coating options you may have used were the cement mortars, the polyethylene tapes, the polyurethanes, the polyolefins, which is known in industry as Protec, the FBE, some of the epoxy polymers, and also with the BWP and RCCP pipe, some of the coating options, if you decide to use a seal coat, it will be a coal tar epoxy, and in some cases, coating is not required, depending on the environment. Next slide. So what extends the life after the coating? Well, cathodic protection. So the photo on the top shows an unprotected metallic structure that doesn't have any cathodic protection. So that particular pipe, it has both cathodic and anodic regions on it. So those areas are constantly interchanging, and that structure is trying to release the energy to get back to its natural source, which is iron ore. And at the bottom photo, you see where cathodic protection has been applied. An anode was attached, which is a more active metal than the structure you're trying to protect, where the anode begins to corrode and pipe becomes the cathode, which is cathodic, to be cathodically protected, hence the term cathodic protection. Next slide. Here are some examples of some sacrificial anodes. You have magnesium anodes, zinc anodes, aluminum anodes, and these are low current capacity anodes, and they are typically used depending on the environment in freshwater applications, soils, brackish water, and seawater applications. Next slide. You also can do an impressed current CP system. So these are the systems that has the higher current capacity. It uses an external power source. You'll need a rectifier in this particular application. You'll need impressed current type of anodes. And these anode examples are like graphite anodes, mixed metal oxide anodes, or platinum anodes are some examples. And this type of system, it allows you to protect those long distance of pipelines, the water tank interiors, rebar structures, some piles, heat exchangers, and there's a multitude of areas that you can protect with this impressed current system. Next slide. Here's some examples of the impressed current anodes. You have some cylinder type, you can have the ribbon and linear type anodes. Next slide. So what about the inside of your structure? Well, you can consider using a lining or corrosion inhibitor. When your pipe is not full of product, you can have sulfuric acid that occur at the top side of your pipe at 12 o'clock position. At the 3 and 9 o'clock position, and as the picture depicts here, you can see where hydrogen sulfide might attack the 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock position of the pipe wall. And corrosion generally doesn't occur on that bottom side as long as you have constant movement of those liquids, solids, and sludge, and there's no stagnant flow. If you do have stagnant or no flow conditions, you can have corrosion occurring on the bottom side of that pipe at 6 o'clock position. Next slide. Some lining options for ductile iron, steel, RCCP, and BWP pipe has been traditionally cement mortars, epoxies, polyurethanes, and glass linings. You can use inhibitors for both ferrous and non-ferrous materials. And some example inhibitor applications has been on the headspace of above ground storage tanks, the interiors of vessels, boilers, and heat exchangers, also during pipe injection, and also with casings, the interstitial space of those casings as well. Next slide. So where do we go from here? Well, you know, the water industry may end up being like the oil and gas industry. Really need to become more proactive than reactive in general. As Dan B. mentioned earlier, you can use those smart tools, perform those inline inspections to get that current condition of your infrastructure. And also consider corrosion control methods for the exterior and internal portion of the asset. Look at the coatings, cathodic protection, the linings, the corrosion inhibitors, and also you make sure you're using the proper materials to be selected to prevent corrosion. Next slide. So 3 takeaways. Well, you know, it really needs to be a paradigm shift. Be more aggressive in monitoring and surveying your asset for the likelihood of corrosion. Think about corrosion control first as part of the project design at the initiation phase instead of after the project has started. And also be sure to perform those subsequent surveys to check each asset at set intervals to help identify any future concerns that you may have to address. Next slide.
All right. Thank you, Jerome.
Thank
Very
you.
good. Good to know. Okay, we are ready for questions. So just to set the stage for the questions, we started off with Sam Sloan, who talked about the challenges of managing a very large utility in the UK, and what are the challenges for obtaining that information, and what do you do with that information, your CCTV data. And then Dan talked about where we're taking artificial intelligence and how we're using that to not only increase the accuracy of our assessment, but the speed. And then we have Viviana talk about the challenges of managing a utility, a manifolded force main utility in a corrosive environment. And then Jerome gave us the corrosion control basics, the tier 1, the tier 2 to the tier 3. And how do you not only understand what's happening with your system, but what can you do about it? So I'm going to start off with the first question with Dan B. And Dan, how much computing power is typically needed to conduct the AI assessment of defects? And can this be a limiting consideration in applying this technology?
That's a great question. Thanks, Susan, and thanks to the asker. So, you know, that's one of the reasons why artificial intelligence has been able to come to the sewer and help out this industry. You know, before, big supercomputers, you know, with names like Deep Blue or whatever, would take up entire labs. They could, you know, almost the size of half a gymnasium, and they cost millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars to build. Well, the advancements and the steps in just raw power of these computing devices has reduced to the size of something that used to take up a gymnasium into something that can, you know, many times fit on the palm of your hand. And also the interconnectivity between these devices has let us access those supercomputers operating, you know, at just a fraction of the cost. So the answer to your question is really 2 parts. Yes, it does take an enormous computing power, but the power is there. We now have cost-effective access to it through the network of mobile devices, and then you don't really need to run this kind of power on your device or your machine here. It can run on computing power that's already in the cloud. And so that's how a lot of AI solutions will end up being.
Very good. Thank you. All right. So let's a question for Jerome, and it is about the sacrificial anode. How much length of pipe does one sacrificial anode typically protect?
Well, in corrosion, there is a term we typically use it depends. It really depends on whether that particular structure is a bare structure or if it has a coating on it. So if you have a coated structure, the current requirements are a lot less than it would be for protecting a bare structure. So it really depends on the coating efficiency as well as the environment you're placed in, how corrosive that environment is. So it's a calculation that can be performed based off of those parameters.
Very good. Thank you. All right. Well, the next question is also for you. All right. What should I consider if I have not checked my cathodic protection system since it was installed?
Well, the best approach is to go in and have that asset surveyed. Go in and do a baseline assessment, just in case you don't have data from historical commission of the system. Perform a new baseline assessment. This gives you current state of your asset. It lets you know if your cathodic protection is still adequately functioning, or you may have to go in and add some more sacrificial anodes or consider adding an impressed current CP system if you've added infrastructure to the existing system. So a survey is definitely needed to enhance that life cycle.
Very good. Thank you. All right. This next question is a Sam Dan B, a combination question. So I'm going to ask them both to turn on their webcams. And so AI is certainly a game changer, but all of us in the water industry, whether we're in America or we're in the UK, have regulators. How do we think that AI will be viewed by the regulators, and will that what challenges do we anticipate we will have in getting something that is using AI approved by the regulators? I'm going to start with Dan and then ask Sam to add to that.
Sure. No, another good question. I think it's important to hold AI or the computers up to the same standards that humans would be held up to in terms of their accuracy. And I can, speaking for the prototype that we're collaborating to develop with Hitachi, our target and our comparison is constantly checking that against human outputs, right? To do as good or better than what a human would do on the same standard. So if there is a standard sewer CCTV defect protocol, that's the bar that we're holding the machine up to, right? So that it should be able to just move right into the same kind of status regulatory approvals, right? In terms of how that data is used.
Okay, Sam, what do you think about from the UK standpoint? Sam, I think you're muted. Hey, you're muted.
There we go. Sorry about that. I was talking away. I agree with that, and I'd say there's kind of two parts for me and after that. So yes, 100% we need to kind of hold the AI up to the same standard as what the human capability can deliver as well. So there's something around accreditation to the standards that we already employ across the UK. But I think there's probably a bit of work to develop those standards as well to be able to hold the AI against those standards, if you like, because I think the standards have been developed and the accreditation has been developed to test humans. So I think there's probably a bit of both. And then from a regulator point of view, I think there's a lot of appetite for it. I know definitely here in the UK, with Ofwat, our regulator, there's a huge push for innovation, for driving efficiency, for delivering more for less. And they're actively trying to encourage the UK water companies to develop these new ways of working. So I do think there's some challenges in terms of that accreditation element of the AI, but I think there's definitely a big appetite for it.
Very good. Thank you both for that. All right, our next question is for Viviana. So I'm going to ask her to turn on her camera. So you talked about the challenges of managing your system and the impacts of corrosion on the manifolded force main system, in that you're under a consent order. And I don't recall if that was a federal or a state, but my question is about the regulatory piece of this. Where you've gotten to with this, does this give you some relief from the regulatory action that your city is facing now?
Yes, certainly it did, because as part we have been proactive in when we started the consent order planning, we didn't have an idea of how our infrastructure condition was. We knew we had troubles, but this gave us another look on how to better plan for our project. So with this assessment, what we did is we presented FDEP, which is the state agency which gave us a consent order. We said, look, based on this assessment, we still need these projects that were originally included in the consent order, but we determined we need also this replacement, and we have a plan in the future, and we are going to be aggressively monitoring in the future our infrastructure. And if we need, we will do further assessment besides a tier 1
Okay.
to be more proactive in our operation.
Very good. Thank you. Appreciate that. All right. We are at the end of our time. I'm going to just summarize. We've heard about the challenges from a UK perspective with Sam Sloan and managing a really, really large utility. And then where are we taking AI with that condition assessment and how a very innovative approach from Dan B. Then Viviana has talked to us about the challenges and certainly from a regulatory standpoint of managing a system that is subjected to a lot of corrosion because of the conditions of being a coastal utility. And then Jerome Griffin has talked to us about corrosion control basics, the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 approach. So I want to thank all of our panelists. I have to say, I've certainly learned a lot and enjoyed listening to you guys talk. So a couple of housekeeping items. Number one, our next webinar is going to be on digital twins. Another cool topic, and I'm sorry, another hot topic. And so look for a link for that. And then PDH credits are available for all of you. Oh, there we go. Thank you, Megan. So a link will be provided when we send out the link. You will click on the link and you will get your PDH certificate. All right, thank you. And that closes us. And thank you all for attending. I really appreciate it. Hello. Hi, I'm Susan Moisio. I'm the Global Solutions Director for Conveyance and Storage for Jacobs in the water market. And we're delighted to have you join us today for our webinar. This is one of a series of webinars where we're discussing hot topics in the water market. Today, we're going to talk about how artificial intelligence and technology tools are addressing aging infrastructure and corrosion control, or AI for AI. So what does aging water infrastructure mean to us as a water team? Well, let me give you some context. When COVID-19, when the virus pandemic hit, the directions that came down to us were to start with washing your hands. And my mother, who is a retired nurse practitioner, had a "I told you so" moment with everyone in the family. But you know what? It is very hard to wash your hands if you can't get the water to the tap. And that is the importance of aging water infrastructure, is keeping your water distribution assets up and running. And the corollary to that, of course, is keeping your sewer assets up and running. So when we picked the topic for today, I challenged my team. And my team on this call are Dan Bonadonna, who is the Global Technology Leader for CARS, for Condition Assessment and Rehabilitation Services, and Jerome Griffin, who is the GTL for Corrosion Control. And I challenged them to look at this from two different ways. I challenged first Dan B to talk to us and start a conversation about innovation, about how do we take artificial intelligence and apply it to our aging water infrastructure. And on the other side, I asked Jerome, please talk to us about the very basics of corrosion control. Why did I do this? I did for two reasons. Number one, I was that young engineer right out of college who got tasked with reviewing all the CCTV tapes for Cincinnati MSD Wastewater Collection Division. And so I know what a game changer it is when we can bring artificial intelligence. Hello. Hi. I'm Moisio. I'm the Global Solutions Director for Conveyance and Storage for Jacobs in the water market. And we're delighted to have you join us today for our webinar. This is one of a series of webinars where we're discussing hot topics in the water market. Today, we're going to talk about how artificial intelligence and technology tools are addressing aging infrastructure and corrosion control, or AI for AI. So what does aging water infrastructure mean to us as a water team? Well, let me give you some context. When COVID-19, when the virus pandemic hit, the directions that came down to us were to start with washing your hands. And my mother, who is a retired nurse practitioner, had a "I told you so" moment with everyone in the family. But you know what? It is very hard to wash your hands if you can't get the water to the tap. And that is the importance of aging water infrastructure, is keeping your water distribution assets up and running. And the corollary to that, of course, is keeping your sewer assets up and running. So when we picked the topic for today, I challenged my team. And my team on this call are Dan Bonadonna, who is the Global Technology Leader for CARS, for Condition Assessment and Rehabilitation Services, and Jerome Griffin, who is the GTL for Corrosion Control. And I challenged them to look at this from two different ways. I challenged first Dan B to talk to us and start a conversation about innovation, about how do we take artificial intelligence and apply it to our aging water infrastructure. And on the other side, I asked Jerome, please talk to us about the very basics of corrosion control. Why did I do this? I did it for two reasons. Number one, I was that young engineer right out of college who got tasked with reviewing all the CCTV tapes for Cincinnati MSD Wastewater Collection Division. And so I know what a game changer it is when we can bring artificial intelligence to bear on this part of the industry. And the other side of this, from a corrosion control standpoint, I think as an industry, we wait too long to bring in the corrosion experts and bring what they can bring to bear what they have to offer. And we wait until we really have a problem. And so I asked Jerome to talk about it from what is corrosion, the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 approach that we take, and how are we going to keep our water assets up and running. And I'm simply delighted that we have two industry experts who are with us today. We have Elaine Huber from Vancouver, and we have Margaret Hannaford from San Francisco Public Utilities Commission. So the way this is going to work, we're going to start off with Elaine, and Elaine is going to talk about the challenge of working with a utility and how do you do the asset management, how do you do the condition assessment. And then Dan is going to talk about how do we bring artificial intelligence into this picture, and he's going to talk about our initiative on AI. We're going to then turn it over to Margaret, and Margaret is going to talk about the Hetch Hetchy Water and Power and the problems that they've had with corrosion control and what have they done from the tier 3 standpoint. And then Jerome is going to dig into that a little bit more and talk to us about the basics. But let's start with some housekeeping items. So we have PDH credits that are available for this. We will have 2 polls that we will do, and please participate. We want to hear from you on the polls. You can put a question in the question box, and we will have time at the end for question and answers. So I'm going to turn it over to Elaine.
Thank you, Susan. I'm very happy to join you to talk about asset management. And I want to give a shout out to everyone who is watching to thank you for your work in asset management. Thanks for everything you're doing to steward our infrastructure and keep us safe. And thank you, Jacobs, for hosting this webinar. It's really good to be here. My name is Elaine Huber, and I'm with the City of Vancouver's Asset Management Program. We're the 4th largest city in the state. We're a growing community with a sewer system covering 62 square miles, serving over almost 200,000 customers. With 2 wastewater plants and almost 800 miles of pipe, our assets are valued a little over $1 billion. Our program works with sewer staff along with other programs to help build their asset management work processes and improve asset knowledge. Vancouver is a safe, vibrant, and welcoming community. We're working to connect to families of all configurations, reinforce our connection to the Columbia River, and support strong economic growth. We have a long history of stewardship for our community assets and are working to address our community visions for sustainability, equity, and climate change. Our utility was formed in 1890 to serve downtown businesses, and now some of these older sections, which are over 100 years old, are still in service. Next slide. Vancouver grew slowly but steadily for several years until World War II, when our wartime population nearly doubled in size. Growth slowed down a little until the 70s, when new bedroom communities added nearly 200 miles in one decade. In 1997, we accomplished the largest annexation in the state of Washington, nearly doubling the size of our city limits overnight. Our service boundary extends into areas of Clark County, but with growth and annexations, about 80% of our collection system is now within the city. And although we have a few older pipes, most of our system, right now 80%, was installed in the last 50 years. Vancouver's earliest pipes were made of vitrified clay and concrete, about 40% of the total right now, gradually transitioning to PVC in the 70s, about 50% of our system. Although we have older sections still in service downtown, only about 18% or 150 miles is beyond its expected useful life of 50 years. Our sewer program has been working on asset management since the 1990s. We're very proactively strengthening their data-driven decision-making by building robust GIS data, work history records, and capital project records. City Council and program staff have consistently supported our CCTV program for over 25 years, which for Vancouver has resulted in solid data capture of the historic condition of our main trunks and interceptors. We also recently transitioned to the nationally recognized NASCO PACP system, continuing to inspect all pipes about every 10 years and more frequently for higher risk pipes. Our TV program completes their pipeline inspections by each basin. We program recurring inspections for all pipes and more frequently for higher risk pipes. As we have grown, we've expanded our pipeline inspection program to 3 full-time inspection teams. Vancouver is also seeing increased demand for other pipeline inspection work, for example, to locate, treat, and remove tree roots. This has been a growing workload that now equals about a third of our pipeline condition inspection program. Vancouver has worked very steadily to strategically plan for growth and expansion while collecting pipeline condition data. The overall system, although still relatively new, has some amount of pipe beyond its useful life. These older pipes, many are the largest in our system, need more frequent inspections all the time, increasing our workload and stretching our resources. Vancouver is very interested in ways we can leverage our existing resources using new technology and approaches to help identify and scope system investments, system risk, and asset investment decisions that preserve and extend asset service life. And with that, I'll say thank you and pass it to Dan.
All right. Thank you, Elaine. So Elaine has effectively talked about the challenge from a utility standpoint. So we're going to turn it over to Dan B, and he's going to take this then in the direction of the innovation.
Thanks, Susan, and thanks again, everybody, for attending. And just like Susan said, I'm going to now take it from, Elaine has painted the picture of what the challenges are, and I'm going to talk about how artificial intelligence is trying to address some of these challenges that municipalities are facing. On the next slide, you can see is kind of a lead into this. Sewer O&M is $50 billion a year worth of government expenditure. And this is the money and time and effort that it takes to maintain and assess and maintain the buried infrastructure and sewer collection systems and treatment works. That's nearly 750,000 miles of public sewer, 500,000 miles of private sewer. That's like going back and forth to the moon 6 or 7 times. And CCTVing even 1% of this is going to produce more than 1,500 days worth of video, which all must be viewed by a human being. And so on the next slide, it's no wonder you can see that catching up and closing the gap here is over $100 billion behind schedule. And as Elaine outlined, all of the things that our municipalities are concerned about in terms of managing, their growth and the profile of their enterprise. I would say that managing aging infrastructure and sewer assessment, the amount of time and effort that it's taking to keep up with that is disproportionate to all these other things that are being taken into that they need to consider. When you look at the ASC report card, often cited as giving our wastewater infrastructure a D+ rating. And the WRF did a study that showed, well, what are some of the big impediments to being able to implement a proactive approach? And you can see the main responses there spanning from funding, technical deficiency, lack of time and personnel, or an absence of a strategy. So in the next slide, we're going to talk about what are the two different technologies that are coming in to help address this issue. So the first one is going to be about automated sewer CCTV defect coding. And the lens I'm going to put for this is through a current collaboration between Jacobs and Hitachi, which is looking at using artificial intelligence to look at the raw CCTV video footage and produce a coded database of defect observations. Next slide. So as we just talked about, the status quo for CCTV condition assessment, it can't keep up. And many cities do have a regular CCTV inspection program, but as we just talked about, we're finding that they still don't have enough time to focus on providing the defect coding to get the accurate and high volume of information that asset managers need to make decisions. And sometimes the methods for even coding that are technically deficient, right? It's not refined enough to get the answers that we need. And it's also disproportionate and inefficient. When we look at that slide, you can see that in the lifespan of about 1,000 feet worth of sewer video, 2 to 6 hours, or 30 to 40% of the total acquisition time is spent doing defect coding. So on the next slide, when you think about all the things that a sewer CCTV inspector crew needs to worry about when they go out to the site, from mobilizing, finding the manholes, setting up traffic control, cleaning, and deploying the camera, then you see that defect coding piece. 30 to 40% of that time is then spent sitting in front of a computer, checking the manual to see, making sure that we're calling a crack, grease to grease, and debris. And then put on top of that the effort that it takes to repair the robot when they pull it out, demobilize, notify emergency personnel, and then transfer the data. So we're looking at streamlining this gap right now and introducing artificial intelligence to help facilitate this. On the next slide, we're going to talk about how different prior efforts have tried to improve this process, but have not yet conquered it. So on the left there, you can see that training standards have reduced the bias, but the majority of data is still heavily skewed. You can see a study done in 2006 showed that looking at the same pipe, over half of the inspectors would still give it a different condition rating based on normal, natural human bias. Image mapping software programs are the next attempt. Those essentially created this huge library of different pictures of defects. And when it looked at a video, it would try to match up the defects to the different slides in the library. But the computing power was just overwhelmed, and it took a vast library of example images to make it efficient. Multi-sensor inspection platforms have been around for a while. That's a fun picture of one of the first ones, laser and sonar technologies, but they are time consuming and limited to really the larger diameters. And then we also have this challenge of trying to incorporate all of the legacy sewer CCTV data, which has a resolution not unlike if any of you had one of those old first generation Motorola Razr phones. That's kind of the resolution of the data that we see coming out of a lot of the legacy data. So if that's the challenge and what the current process was for humans, we have a polling question that I'll ask. If we could introduce a machine, artificial intelligence, what level of accuracy would you expect from a machine, considering now that the data would be complete from tip to tail and consistent, right? There'd be no bias in the output. I'll give everybody a few seconds to provide an answer. Okay, let's look and review some of the results. Well, I appreciate everybody participating, and you can see that most people would expect, at least scoring an A, right, or a B+. Well, let's look at what some of the prototype results have shown us. So looking under the hood of some of the results of this initial collaboration, right now I'm showing you an individual pipe graph. So this is a classic schematic from pipeline inspection. This would be like if you took a pipe inspection and slid it along the top and then unfolded it. On the x-axis, you have the footage along the pipeline, and on the y-axis, you have the clock position. So the blue dots there are observations or defects that a human had observed and flagged during their inspection. And the orange dots are what the machine predicted. And the size and depth of color of the orange dot is proportionate to its confidence interval, that interval from that observation. And what we can see on the slide here is very good agreement between just the initial prototype results from the AI and the human observations. We see clusters of large dark dots near the same clusters of human observations, well within a 90% accuracy range. On the next slide, if we want to take that out and look at 100 or 1,000 different pipes, we want to look at, well, what is the AI, how would those scores compare, right, in terms of a rating of good, fair, or poor? Well, you can see this comparison on the left between what the humans would have found in terms of rating their pipes good, fair, or poor, and what the machine would find on the right in terms of rating pipes good, fair, and poor. And again, we see good agreement well within 90%, with the machine being slightly more conservative about what a fair or poor pipe would look like. Next slide. So how is this going to help? We're talking about being able to gather more complete data. Machines never blink when they're reviewing the information. We're talking about improved data consistency. Machines are not biased, and machines don't get bored reviewing CCTV data. And it's also faster. Machines do not fatigue. We can get through terabytes of data in a fraction of the time. And if anybody has been out there trying to drive or deploy one of these CCTV rigs, you know how difficult it is just to get in and out of the sewer. And our objective is to let the crews focus on that high value work and leave the data cataloging task to the machines. So the next thing I'm going to talk about here, next innovation of artificial intelligence. Once we have the data in hand, how can we assist our engineers to consume that, analyze it, and make decisions? I'm going to talk about AI for predicting service life and optimizing O&M. So the next slide shows, kind of, again, setting the stage of the challenges here. The biggest obstacles that we've seen in this industry are insufficient funding. It takes a lot of time and effort and resources to do this data analysis, and also a lack of strategy, right? What is the best decision to make with the data in hand? And what we found is even a 10% accuracy in increasing the accuracy of structural remaining useful life or O&M maintenance frequencies can result in a life cycle cost savings of up to 25%. So the next slide is kind of the status quo, right? It shows how many current programs predict remaining useful life or optimize asset management or optimize O&M activities. So you can see the data on the right. Usually we try to reduce things into two important variables: age and some measure of score, right, or some measure of condition. And we try to force a condition decay curve through this. This is a very common practice. But what you can see is that's real data. Oftentimes, this is the kind of information that we need to try to crunch and fit a nice curve through. It's been called a sneeze before. You can see that that's a challenge to try and suss out from that data the strongest correlations. Other predictive models try to use tree logic, a variety of if-then statements, but these can take months to map out, even for just a few variables, and can't encompass all of the complexity and richness of the data. And so all of these efforts are behind trying to answer questions like, when will the pipe fail? How will it fail? And what's the best way to prevent that failure? So the next slide shows how AI and what makes machine learning different. So on the left is kind of your classic regression plot. Y equals mx plus b fit to a bunch of set data. And on the right is a deep neural network, right? And how those different dots are interacting with each other and how that correlation is being made. And one way that you can try to visualize this, if we think about a classic regression plot on 2 dimensions, think about, well, what if you could introduce a 3rd dimension? And now you had 3-dimensional data points, and you could try to fit a regression curve through that. Well, now it's hard to visualize, but think about if you had a 4th dimension, or a 5th, or 100, or 1,000, and each one of those had its own regression customized line to it. That's what we're talking about with deep neural networks, the ability for a machine to recognize patterns in very complex data and predict outcomes without being explicitly programmed. On the next slide, so we're going to peek underneath the hood again and look at what some of the initial prototypes of using AI, artificial intelligence, to crunch sewer CCTV condition data and predict remaining useful life. So the graph here on the x-axis is time. We have the time between different inspections, right, between sewer pipe inspections. And on the y-axis is a measure of score. It's a reflection of the different combination of defects in a sewer. The dots on the left-hand side are the scores that a human would have observed, right, doing a CCTV pipe inspection. And then the lines that protrude from those are the predicted remaining, the decay curves that the machine would have predicted. And you can see how some of them are a little flatter or a little steeper than others. And the dots on the right are the second kind of follow-up inspection. And we can see very good agreement between what the machine would have predicted based only off the observation on the left and how it would intersect the dots on the right within a very tight range of accuracy. But as the next slide will show, we're still limited to the old classic adage, garbage in equals garbage out. And so here's an example of where predictions that still miss the test data and how important it is to make sure that the data that comes in is accurate so that we can improve the accuracy and match up with our predictions remaining useful life. So on the next slide, we're going to talk about kind of, again, pulling back and looking at thousands of pipes, right, at a time, and what the prediction, what the accuracy looks like. On the left is what a conditional decay curve might look like, and you can see the R² value, which is a classic representation of more or less accuracy. That's a negative R². 1.8 is what it says there on the screen. If we look at the initial prototypes from artificial and machine learning predictions, there we see R² values of 0.81. A vast leap forward in terms of accuracy of predicting remaining useful life on data in hand. And so my last slide kind of talks about what this means practically, right, for consuming this data. Well, if we look at two different pipes, right, or different materials, different defects, kind of the old way would typically produce the same numeric score, right? And from that, a lot of the current systems that are out there would use a traditional decay curve and would recommend the same kind of proactive or remediation strategy. Now with AI, we can really consume the complexity, the different combinations of what the pipe materials are made of, what the exact combination of defects is, and give it a specific RUL and a specific recommended improvement. And this will also let us build in much more specific localized predictors that weren't necessarily cost effective to build into some of the tools before. Things like looking at the installing contractor or a specific make and manufacture of pipe and not just pipe material. All those can help greatly improve the accuracy for both predicting capital improvements and optimizing O&M strategies. And with that, I'll say thanks and pass it to our next speaker.
All right, thank you so much, Dan. So Dan has talked about then the challenge of meeting that challenge. Elaine talked about the challenge, and Dan talked about how are we going to meet this challenge using AI. So we're going to shift then and turn to San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, and Margaret is going to talk about the challenge of meeting corrosion control in a major urban environment. Margaret?
Hi, thank you for having me. Can we go to the next slide? So San Francisco Public Utilities Commission provides water, power, and sewer services to the Bay Area. And they own assets that start in Yosemite National Park, so up in the Sierra Nevada foothills, and run all along the San Joaquin Valley and end up delivering water and power and sewer services to San Francisco. So my facilities that I manage for the Hetch Hetchy Water and Power Division run from Yosemite National Park all the way down to Sunol, which is beginning sort of the East Bay area. So the pipelines that we're going to talk about today are the pipelines that run across the San Joaquin Valley. There are 3 pipelines. We also have a 4th barrel but 3 pipelines that run about 47.5 miles long. They deliver about 307 MGD to a population of about 2.7 million people. And we're going to talk a little bit about our journey. Back in the 80s, we started having some leakage in our San Joaquin Pipeline 3. We started this process where we were actually excavating the pipe, repairing it, then looking, doing some soil information on resistivity. We were also doing DCVG, trying to sort of figure out what was going on, why we were getting these leaks. And really what it was almost like a beginning of a desktop analysis, like a tier 1, and then also a tier 2 where we're excavating and confirming the damage that we have on the pipe. It was sort of an ad hoc process all the way through 2005 until we brought on a consultant that ended up being Jacobs to help us come up with a more systematic process. And I was not happy with what I was getting. And I really wanted to go that next step. So our talk today is going to be our journey to get to tier 3, which is using an inline inspection tool. And we'll talk a little bit about how we went along that journey. Next slide. So again, I was talking about the pipes that we're looking at. These are a picture of the pipes excavated that run across the San Joaquin Valley. They range in age from about 50 to 85 years old. They range in diameter from 60, about 56 inches up to 78 inches. And these pipelines just give you an idea of about 15 feet on center. Next slide. Okay, so when we started out looking at what our Tier 3 goals and objectives were, what we were really looking at doing is, could we manage or extend the life of the asset? But also, you know, we could not have the risk of having a lot of unplanned outages. Our reliability had to be one of our important goals. So we set out, what did we need to find? We needed to establish a baseline data of our corrosion. We needed to be able and get in there, and if we identified problems, we needed to be able to repair it immediately. We wanted to understand the rate of corrosion that we were experiencing on the asset, but all in all, we wanted to understand what it was going to cost us to maintain this asset, extend the life, and get a better understanding of when we actually had to repair or replace, the asset, and how we were putting that into our capital budget. We're going to talk about that MFL tool, but those were some of the pictures of the MF tool on a little platform before it goes into the pipeline. Okay, so we did a lot of evaluation, but as I said, we ended up using magnetic flux leakage technology. It was commonly used, has been used in the gas and oil industry since 1965. We started looking into this in about 2007. And let's talk a little bit about how that works. If you look at the pictures on the right, you'll see the top two. One that's a steel pipeline with 5 dents or actually indentations representing corrosion in there. What the MFL tool does is when you drag it through the pipeline, it magnetizes the pipe and it creates these signatures. If there's no loss in corrosion on the pipe, the line is straight. But as you can see, there's 5 areas of corrosion on the left, and you can see those 5 the areas of corrosion depicted on the squiggly lines on the right. So we've determined that we could probably get this done in 2008, and we built our first tool in 2010. In 2010, we inspected about 7.4 miles of that 49.5 miles of pipeline. And in 2017, we inspected another 38 miles. And we continue to develop this baseline data and inspect our pipelines. Next one. So that will be it for our discussion today. I know that I haven't really gone into the technology, but if you want to learn more, there's an AWWA document on M77 manual for condition assessment of water mains. There's a whole chapter dedicated to the MFL device that the city, San Francisco Public Utilities Commission created. So thank you.
All right, thank you, Margaret. I really appreciate that. Good look at a Tier 3 assessment of a very critical pipeline for San Francisco. All right, so we're going to move over to Jerome, who's going to talk to us about the basics of corrosion control. Jerome?
All right, thank you all for joining the call. As Susan mentioned, I'll be discussing corrosion control basics in the water and wastewater industry. Next slide, please. Let's start with a couple photos just to show some minor corrosion or corrosion that's considered the good, if you will. On the left, you see some atmospherically exposed pipe that has some minor uniform corrosion and general corrosion taking place at the pipe surface. And on the right side, you'll see some galvanic corrosion that has took place where dissimilar metals were used and coupled together. And for now, it's considered some good corrosion in which it may advance over time to be more aggressive since dissimilar metals were used. Next slide. And now we have a couple photos of moderate corrosion. This is considered the bad. The photo on the left has some corrosion nodules that's formed on the carbon steel tank floor. And you can also see that there's some pits that's starting to form on the shell of the same tank. Now on the right side, you will see a more exotic material that was used with a feature that's similar to the nodules on the other side, but this feature has crystallized and it has allowed the product to be maintained within the structure. So that additional time that this feature allows you that time to go in and consider adding a liner to this particular material application. Next slide. And here's a few pictures of the severe corrosion, the ugly corrosion. So the top left, you will see some through wall corrosion that's occurred on a pipeline. The top center, that used to be a carbon steel well. The casing well is no longer there. On the right side, you'll see some rebar corrosion that's occurred from erosion corrosion. And the two pictures with the gloves, that used to be the roof of a above ground storage tank, and it was found to actually land on the tank floor during a tank inspection. Next slide. So some things to consider for corrosion control. Consider that location and environment. The picture on the right, you'll see a pipeline that was installed in a right-of-way, and right-of-way maintenance need to be performed. So you have a tree that has grown and damaged the coating on that pipeline, so some remediation will be needed on that asset. So think ahead where you install your asset. Make sure you perform that right-of-way maintenance and understand why it makes a difference. And also consider the corrosion potential and the risks that can result, the likelihood times the consequence. Next slide. And as mentioned, we used a tier 1 and tier 2 and tier 3 process approach. Tier 1 was above ground surveys, tier 2 are within excavations, and a tier 3 are the more sophisticated tools, as Margaret and Dan B mentioned, those inline inspection tools. Next slide. So with tier 1, the city of Fort Lauderdale, they were experiencing a recent history of forced main breaks. So we went in and we performed a survey to see what was going on with the exterior surface of those forced mains. So we surveyed 42 miles of main. We captured those soil resistivity readings. We captured some pipe to soil potentials, and we used that data to overlay it with the recent breaks that they had, and also to help identify any hotspot locations or any future locations that they may have with corrosion likelihood. Next slide. And we also created a mobile app. This was created so we can input that pipe to soil data and also the soil resistivity data. And we could put it in the app and it uploaded in real time. Next slide, please. So here's a few pictures of some field measurements being captured, where we captured some corrosion potentials or pipe to soil readings in a vault, also in a manhole. And the photo on the right shows where some soil resistivity measurements are being captured using the 4-pin Wiener method. Next slide. And tier 2. So tier 2, in case you don't have that vault or that manhole accessible, you may have to excavate a pothole. So at an excavation, you can actually capture a UT reading for the remaining wall thickness. You can check to see if there's a coating present in case your as-built wasn't available. And also you can measure those pits with a pit depth gauge. You can check that backfill to see what the pH is, maybe send a backfill off for analysis to see how corrosive it is, maybe with chlorides or sulfates. And also you can check for redox and potential, as well as groundwater influence. And you can see on that picture below the letter there is some groundwater intrusion at that excavation. And also, as far as a pothole, you can pothole behind a curb or in a street to capture that corrosion potential or pipe to soil measurement. And you can also see again if a coating may be present that you didn't know. about. And also you can pull that soil sample to do a soil resistivity or send it off for analysis as well. Next slide. And as part of that tier 2, you can consider adding a test station. This can be a flush mounted at grade test station, maybe in the street, or a post mounted or above grade test station that's behind the curb. And this allows you to capture that corrosion measurement without having to do a future excavation. Next slide. So tier 3. As Margaret mentioned, San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, they ran that MFL2 to scan that entire pipe circumference to see what the remaining wall thickness was to help identify those locations where they had external and internal corrosion. Also any ovality concerns such as dents and gouges, and also they were able to identify the joint locations, manufacturing defects, and other features and anomalies on our pipeline that they wasn't aware of. And that MFL2 allowed them to get that real-time information about their pipeline in the current condition. Next slide. And as Margaret mentioned, some of the pipelines were up to 80 years old, typically in a historical problematic area. Again, it pinpointed that corrosion damage, also identified some of the third-party damage areas that occurred, maybe those that were known and those that were unknown. And also we're able to locate the modifications that they may have made within the system in the past occurred repairs that may have happened on the line that they didn't have records for. And you can make a decision based off of the MFL tool used to see if you want to do just a replacement, maybe a cutout, or just a simple repair based on the results of the MFL tool. Next slide. Okay, so I have a polling question. So what methods do you use to protect against corrosion to enhance the service life of your infrastructure? I'll give you about 30 seconds or so to answer this question. Okay, any results? Okay, it appears though most individuals are using the coatings and cathodic protection. Okay, I'll discuss those two as well as corrosion inhibitors and linings. Next slide, please. Okay, so how does corrosion occur? What's the science behind it? Well, I guess I'll start by saying I was like many of you. I didn't know what corrosion was years ago. Actually, I can go back to when I was a kid. I used to take all my toys apart and try to put them back together. I always wanted to fix things and had a main interest in electricity and electronics. So my electrical background led me into corrosion. So now it's been over 20 years and I've been in the industry and obtained several NACE and NASCO certifications for corrosion. Next slide. So what is corrosion? Well, corrosion is a loss of material due to the reaction with the environment. Now that can be thought of as mainly metals, but it also affects non-metals as well. It depends on how corrosive that environment is. Next slide. So with corrosion, there's 4 parts that are needed. If you remove any one of these parts, corrosion cannot occur. You need to have an anode, that is the section that will corrode. You need to have a cathode, that is a structure that will be protected by that anode. You need to have a pathway, that is the connection between the anode and the cathode. And you'll need to have electrolyte. So it can either be submerged in soil, water, or have moisture present, just to have that ionic pathway. Next slide. So how do you prevent corrosion? Well, really the first line of defense is some protective coatings. Traditionally for ductile iron pipe, in the past, the standard has been using no coating. When you go that route, you're subject to how corrosive the environment is, how corrosive is that soil you install it, how corrosive is that water. And also you're prone to stray current interference from foreign structures foreign CP systems, dynamic straight currents, overhead power as well. And as far as some past ductile iron coatings that were used as a barrier to help prevent those issues, there were the standard polyethylene encasements, also known as the polywraps, the polyethylene tapes, the polyurethanes, and also the FBE coatings. And some of the current newer options that's available is an enhanced V-Bio version of the polywrap that has microbial activity protection. And also you can go with a zinc-coated ductile iron pipe instead of the standard DIP. Next slide. And as far as welded steel pipe, some of the coating options you may have used were the cement mortars, the polyethylene tapes, polyurethanes, the polyolefins, many known as Protec, the FBEs, and some epoxy polymers. And as far as the BWP and RCCP pipe, some of the coating options may have been a seal coat that was considered, being epoxy or polyurethane, or maybe no coating was needed depending on the environment. Next slide. So what extends the life after coating? You can consider adding cathodic protection. So the picture on top, you'll see where there's the unprotected bare structure that has both cathodic and anodic regions on it. So these regions are constantly interchanging, and this state is trying to get back to being iron ore. So that energy is trying to release from that structure by being formed to get back to the native state of iron ore. And at the bottom, you'll see where a cathodic protection was added, where an anode was used. So the anode will corrode to protect that structure, which now becomes solely a cathode, and it becomes cathodic. And that is the reason for the term cathodic protection, because the structure being protected is cathodic, and the anode will corrode. Next slide. And here's some examples of some sacrificial anodes. You have magnesium anodes, zinc, aluminum. These are low current capacity anodes, can be used in fresh water, soil, brackish water, and seawater as well. Next slide. And you can go with the impressed current CP system if you need more of a current, larger current capacity. You will use an external power source from the power company. You need a rectifier as well. Some of the impressed type current anodes you would use would be like the graphite type anodes, mixed metal oxides, or platinum type anodes. And there's other like high silicon anodes that can be used as well. And this type of CP system is designed to protect those long distance pipelines or those larger structures, also water tank interiors, rebar structures, piles, heat exchangers, and there's a multitude of applications for these impressed current system. Next slide. And here's some examples of impressed current anodes. You have the cylinder type, you have the ribbon type, and also the linear type impressed anodes. Next slide. So what about the inside of your structure? You need interior protection as well. Well, you can consider using a lining or a corrosion inhibitor. So when your pipe is not full of product, like a picture depicts, you can see at the 12 o'clock position, you may have corrosion occurring due to sulfuric acid at the top side of your pipeline. Also, the pipeline shows the product is around the 3 p.m. to 9 p.m. range. You may have some hydrogen sulfide occurring on the sides of your pipe. And the bottom side, around the 6 o'clock position, you typically don't have any corrosion occurring as long as those acids are being constantly moved and flushed away. But if you do have a no flow or stagnant condition, you can have bottom side corrosion occurring. Next slide, please. And some lining options that's been used for ductile steel, RCCP, and BWP pipe has been the cement mortars, the epoxies, the polyurethanes, glass, and there's other options as well. And corrosion inhibitors can be used for both ferrous and non-ferrous. So it can be used for those metallics and non-metallics. And some examples of corrosion inhibitor use has been used on head spaces of the above ground storage tanks, the interiors of the vessels, boilers, heat exchangers, even during pipe injections, and also on casings for the interstitial space to protect that area. Next slide. So where do we go from here? Well, the water industry may end up being like the oil and gas industry. Need to become more proactive than reactive in general. You need to perform those surveys and inline inspection tools and smart tools that Margaret and Dan B mentioned to get that current condition of your infrastructure and see what the status is of it. And also you need to consider some external and internal corrosion protective methods. Consider those coatings, those linings, the cathodic protection, corrosion inhibitors, and also consider the materials that you are selecting to prevent some of the galvanic corrosion, dissimilar corrosion, and other corrosion issues that can occur. Next slide. So 3 takeaways. Really need to be a paradigm shift. Really need to be more aggressive monitoring and surveying your assets for corrosion. Also think about corrosion control first at the onset of a project. Don't think about corrosion after the project has started. And also be sure to perform those subsequent surveys to check the condition of your assets at set intervals, and also to help identify some corrosion control concerns from those surveys, whether it's initial survey or a survey that's to follow in the future. And with that, thank you for your time.
All right, thank you, Jerome. Very good discussion on the basics of corrosion control. I'm going to ask all of the panelists to turn back on their webcams as we move into the question and answer. And so let me just summarize what we've heard. We started off with Elaine, who talked about what are the challenges of managing a sewer system, and what from a asset management condition assessment standpoint. And then we moved into Dan B talking about using artificial intelligence to meet that challenge. We then heard from Margaret on a tier 3 inspection of a very critical asset for them, and then went to the basics with corrosion control with Jerome Griffin. So I'm going to start off. I'm going to ask Jerome a question. And Jerome, the question is, what should I consider if I have not checked my cathodic protection system since it was installed?
Well, depending on when it was installed, you really need to go in and get a current state condition of it. So if you have a cathodic protection, let's say it's an impressed current system, you will need to check the rectifier to make sure it's functional, check the ground bed as well to make sure it's still putting out current. And also you need to perform a survey on your assets to make sure that they're either receiving some level of protection or if they're adequately protected from the existing CP system. So a baseline survey will need to be performed just to see what the condition is. So you may find that your system is still functioning properly, or you may have to do some modifications to it by adding some additional anodes or doing some modifications to the rectifier or the sacrificial system that's in place.
All right, thank you very much. All right, this next question is one for Elaine and Dan B. And as we move into going from the traditional method of evaluating our CCTV data and use artificial intelligence, what if any challenges do you think you will have from the regulators, or how well do you think that this will be accepted? So I'm going to start with Dan and then ask Elaine. So go ahead, Dan.
Thanks, Susan. Yeah, that's a great question. I can say that from the development standpoint of the prototype and to the collaboration to build the artificial intelligence tool, the standard that we're holding is the current industry standard that a human would be held up to in order in terms of providing accurate sewer CCTV defect coding and evaluation and assessment. And so that's what is currently rolls into the asset management plans that are then fed up to the regulators from that standpoint. So the expectation from the industry and that's baked into the development effort here is that the AI should perform just as good, if not better, than a human in terms of the data collection. So from that standpoint, shouldn't be asking the regulators for a change in terms of how they're perceiving the data coming out of a machine.
Very good. And Elaine, from your standpoint, do you think that there will be resistance to moving to using artificial intelligence?
All of the regulators I'm familiar with at the Department of Ecology would be extremely receptive to anything that improves our predictability for decision making. That includes condition assessment data collection, predicting service life for pipes, and more than that, supporting financial planning that's sustainable for the sewer utility for Vancouver.
Very good. Thank you. All right. This question is for Margaret. Margaret, one of the things that you shared with us is that you pressed to get to Tier 3 inspection. And could you dig into that a little bit deeper on your decision-making process, on why you felt you needed to go so quickly to a Tier 3? So you're very...
Go ahead. San Francisco Public
Utilities. It was hard to hear you.
Okay, San Francisco Public Utilities Commission was investing in infrastructure, and the decision was made that there were other projects that needed to go forward first. So we had originally thought we were going to replace one of the San Joaquin pipelines, but it got actually put on the shelf. So the decision was made, well, what is the condition of those assets? And are they going to be reliable into the future? And based on what we had done on the Tier 1 and Tier 2, we really couldn't provide that information to the customer and really show them that the asset was going to be reliable into the future, and that it would and that we could minimize the number of unplanned outages. And so that was really what pushed us to Tier 3. We needed to be able to provide better information on the condition of the asset and our ability to make sure that we would have minimal unplanned outages.
Very good. Thank you. All right. I'm going to ask this question of Dan B. As we move into using artificial intelligence, all of us have learned the challenges of our computer systems lately. And so what does it take from a computing power to make this work?
Yeah, no, that's another a good question. Thanks for asking. So there's two parts to answer that question. One, it takes a lot of computing power. But two, the other thing I want to share is that today, that's one of the reasons why artificial intelligence has come to the sewer, is that before, the kind of supercomputing power that we'd be talking about would take up half a gymnasium and costs tens of millions of dollars. In the last few years, we've seen the power go up exponentially and the size of these devices go down exponentially as well, to the point where you have access to them through things like mobile devices and cloud computing at a fraction of the cost. So now that's one of the benefits of this, is that we can access those kind of supercomputing power resources. Just, it doesn't need to be on your machine. It can all be run through the cloud through a shared.
Very good. Thank you very much. All right, Jerome, a question for you. What is the typical life expectancy unprotected bare structures?
Well, it really depends on how corrosive the environment is. You really need to take those soil resistivity measurements. You need to see what the corrosivity is, and also send that off for analysis as well. You can have that one data point of having soil resistivity, but also check for the redox potential. See what the sulfate levels are. Also check for the chloride levels as well. So it's really dependent on those factors, and also your selection of protection against it, such as consider adding a coating depending on how corrosive the environment is. Also consider adding cathodic protection to supplement a coating if needed. Those are really the keys to enhancing your asset. And if you were fortunate enough to have a long life cycle without doing the due diligence in that at the onset, you're lucky. But now it's best to capture those data points on the front end. And I mean, if you've received 50, 80 years of life of your asset, just think if you would have had those protective barriers, you could at least double that hypothetically from what you're experiencing. So you may not see these corrosion issues pop up. So it'll come further down the line.
Okay, thank you very much. This one's for Margaret, and I guess we kind of have this question on just about every one of our webinars, and it has to do with changes due to climate. Do you see from a corrosion standpoint for your assets that climate change impacts will cause more corrosion to occur in your assets, or do you think that it will not have an impact?
I'm going to say that we haven't even considered that. We're just focusing right now on climate change, on how it's going to impact our water supply. So I haven't thought about it, and it might be something I look at. Thank you for the question.
Okay, very good. Thank you. All right, so gonna switch back to Jerome for this question. What is ideal to consider if I as a utility manager are starting to notice that certain portions of my system are having more repairs?
Well, it goes back to going out and having a survey performed, just to see what may have changed on your system. It still starts with capturing that soil resistivity data, also capturing corrosion potentials as well. You may have a location that's accessible, maybe in a vault or a manhole, that you can take a pipe of soil reading, or you may have to pothole or excavate just to see what's happening at that location. You can also look at the slope and critical angles you may have on your system, just to see if you may have some liquid holdup points, because it could also be an internal corrosion issue as well. So really just investigate those repair methods being used as well, because it's possible you may have used a dissimilar metal during your repair. So you may think you have corrected the issue with corrosion, but you obviously created an additional issue that you're going to have down the future. So you may have damaged some of those linings or damaged some of the external coatings during the repair, and also compounded it even further by using a dissimilar metal at that location.
Okay, and I guess a follow-up to this is you mentioned during your talk that corrosion is not only on metal pipelines, but that we have corrosion with other materials as well. Can you expand upon that a little bit?
Yeah, everything is subject to corrosion, you know. I mean, we're actually corroding as we speak. So everything is subject to corrosion. So not just materials. So yeah, even non-metals, you know, it has it may be more so prone to being called degradation, but it still is going to deplete over time. So anything you can do to protect that. And it still relates back to the environment. Also the temperature, operating parameters, make sure you're not exceeding those thresholds for the material or product that you're using. And there's a lot of materials that we use that has corrosion inhibitor in it, such as when they're shipping valves, some of the packing has a corrosion inhibitor lined on it to make sure that valve is not corroded by the time you receive it. So there's a lot around us that has corrosion inhibitors on it, packing material related, aside from just water materials that's being used.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, so last question. It's going to Dan B, and it is. Let me make sure I can click on this and read it for you. Was there a cost analysis between use of AI versus a human time?
Yeah, from a standpoint of cost analysis, yeah, I mean, the machine is going an order of magnitude faster than human time, right? And so if you look at the time spent that a machine could do it, you know, the inspectors wouldn't need to do any of the inspection as they're going through the pipes. So we're talking about a savings of 30 to 40% of the total inspection time. Those 2 to 6 hours of time that we talked about spent doing coding would be reduced to minutes, would be the cost.
Very good. All right. Well, that runs us up to the end of our time. So I want to just summarize what we've talked about today in our conversation on AI for AI. We started off understanding what the challenges are from a utility standpoint with Elaine in Vancouver, and then the innovation that is there in the industry from an artificial intelligence standpoint with DMB. And then Margaret gave us a good look at a tier 3 evaluation of a critical asset in San Francisco. And thank you. That was very interesting. It's always good to see the practical and how it's being applied. And then Jerome talked to us about the corrosion control basics and tier 1, tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. So I want to thank all of the panelists. As always, we learn a lot from these. I do anyway. And I want to invite you then two things. One, our next webinar on Hot Topics is going to be about digital twins, which is another cool topic out there. And PDH credits for those of you who need them for your licenses are available. And with that, again, thank you all for joining us. We appreciate it.
This is King Wong from Institute of Utility Specialists. I'm the current executive president. Talking about utilities, we are all care about it because it is as important as all the human organs or our blood vessels in our body. And utility is that important. If you may compare between the organ and the utilities on the left and on the right. And what is utility specialist? Utility is talking about our safety and security, and also talking about how to improve our living standards. We can divide utility specialists into 3 groups, namely location, condition, and management. For its success, we need the major pillars, including standardization, professionalization, data management, international, and modern management. All this, we need also professional promotion. So let's talk about professionalization. This is the path for a general layman to become a professional. So we set the standard, we train them to the standard, we get them with experience, and we issue with license. That is the professional status. And continuously, we address with their continuous professional development. That is CPD. This is one of my master students who completed her master degree in the University of Hong Kong. In her conclusion, there are many factors affecting the utility specialists or utility safety, and the core is people. And that's why we need professionals. And professionals, we need to be vetted, regulated, and so training, education, safety requirement, continuous professional development, job reference, and any review are those requirements for being a member and being continuous as a member. And there are many different standards available in the world for underground utility service. Here are some from Hong Kong. One of those is HKCCEC, which will be published again in later this year as CCEC, full name as Conduit Condition Evaluation Codes 2020. And here you can see pictures, videos, reports, and of course, those scores and grades of underground drain pipes so that we can evaluate and make decisions for further improvement, such as replacement or rehabilitations. And here are other publications made by IIUS together with HKIUS recently. You may download this information from the IIUS or HKIUS website. And they include pamphlets, guidelines, and training materials. Talking about training, the minimum for utility specialists is 10 days training, including theory, practical, examination, and reports. And of course, if they feel they are good enough, they can attend a trade test directly for the result. And there are different levels of training. We call it qualification frameworks. So we have level 1, 2, 3, 4, and level 5. Level 1 is the most basic, just 1 day induction training. And this is only good for the client's representative. And level 2, which is foundation certificate, it is good for assistant. Level 3, which is professional certificate, 84 hours as minimum, which is good for our operators. And with level 3 certificate and plus other information such as experience, they can apply for membership of IIUS in the general trade. For level 4 and level 5, which are diploma and professional diploma or a degree equivalent, which takes more than 270 hours and 400 hours. These are now accredited in different places for offering diploma and professional diplomas, including in India, Malaysia, mainland China, and of course in Hong Kong as well. And these photos shows you some of those participants who come from Sarawak, Malaysia to Hong Kong for 2 weeks training for the professional certificate in utility service. And they are all happy with the result in Hong Kong's training status as well. And you are welcome to come and have a look as well. And talking about training, we also need to do some promotions. So IIUS are traveling around the world to different places for promotions. Just for now, today, 26th of November, there is a show in Shanghai, mainland. Some of our local reps are there as well. And courses being accredited in different places, as I mentioned, including mainland China, Hong Kong, India, and Malaysia. And with this, they can have their diploma and professional diplomas. And here, may I remind you that all the diploma or professional diplomas, they need to have some sort of refreshment every 3 years so that they still maintain the knowledge of the utility profession. And talking about standards, we also have the survey accuracy for different surveys. And you can download this information from the pamphlet or guidelines as well. These surveys include conduit condition evaluation, level 1 and level 2, manhole internal condition survey, again level 1 and level 2, and also level 3. We have the water leak detection for level 0, 1, 2, and 3. And lastly, we have the comprehensive utility survey. Again, we have level 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And level 3 is the most standard requirement for utility survey, which is talking about 90% of the sample shall be within 200 millimeter or 0.15 of the depth. And with level 3, they can also go for underground BIM. And there's a underground BIM standard published by the local construction industry council. And you may download a copy from their website. And there, all the information which subject to the accuracy requirement of HKIUS or IIUS, they can produce with the underground BIM map, as you can see now. And more importantly, in Hong Kong, the government asked for all the underground projects with contract sum more than 30 million Hong Kong dollars, they all need to submit with the BIM submissions. And if you can download from this link for more detail of underground BIM products. With all this, let's introduce to you the formation of IIUS, which is now headquartered in Hong Kong, a non-profit organization, a professional body. The steering committee was founded on the 1st of November 2013 in Hong Kong. And after some 5 years, it was inaugurated in Guangzhou, mainland China in 2018 for its executive committee commenced on the 1st of January 2019. And this was the photo at the day of formation for the steering committee. And for the executive committee formation in Guangzhou in 2018. And the main objective of IIUS including professional standards, course accreditation, professional recognition, and promotion of utility profession. And we also provide PII, cover different services PII stands for Professional Indemnity Insurance. However, without leadership of IIUS, we cannot go further. So in IIUS, we have different tiers of professionals, including our honorary members, those are by invitation only, including our patrons, usually president of recognized university with engineering courses, honorary president, those key personnel in the related government departments or members of the major academy, honorary fellows, those persons who hold a senior position and make significant contribution to the utility specialist industry, and honorary advisors, a person who in engineering or non-engineering field, however, make valuable contribution to the society. And here are our IIUS patrons, including President of the Zhuhai College of Higher Education, President of the Hong Kong Polytechnic University, the President-elect of the Hong Kong Baptist University, the President of Hong Kong Open University, and the President of the University of Hong Kong. And Honorary President, we have two, including Dr. Chen Shang-Shen, who is a member of the China Academy of Engineering, and our Professor Samuel, you may know him well, who is a member of the Academy of Canadian Academy of Engineering. And we have quite a number of honorary fellows, including from different countries, different cities. The current president of IIUS is Engineer Professor Eric Ma Xiu-Chang, who was the Secretary of Development in the Hong Kong SAR government. And myself, King Wong, is the immediate past president of HKIUS and also being the executive president of IIUS. And we have vice president and local rep from different cities. And we have in total among 30 cities in the world who there will be vice president or local rep. And we share the same. We strive for enhancing professional standards in the utility specialist industry. And you are welcome to join as well. And the development of mainland China is rapid, and the development of the Greater Bay Area, GBA, will be rapid as well. So IIUS has also become a member of the GBA last year. And we have organized events in different countries and cities, including Australia, China, Malaysia, India, and Hong Kong, Macau as well. This year, due to the virus, we are not able to travel much, and we would like to here to support our Nordic India Show to 2020, and our best wish for its success as well. Being a supporting organization of the Nordic India Show 2020, we also welcome and invite you to join as well. And we have been in different places, in Malaysia, Sabah, in Kuching, in Kuala Lumpur, in Australia, in Taiwan, Kaohsiung, and of course, Hong Kong and mainland China, such as Guangzhou, Beijing, Shanghai, and also we have been to Xiamen, so on and so forth. And our current event is happening in Shanghai, China. We used to organize ECUMES, the International Conference on Utility Management and Safety, since 2009. We plan to have the 7th ECUMES in 2020, yet due to the virus, we are not able to conduct this year. So we now plan to have it in Malaysia 2021. and you are welcome to join as well. And these are photos of our past equipments. First equipments, third equipments, the fourth equipments in Beijing, and the fifth equipments in Hong Kong, Guangzhou. And this will be the sixth equipments in Guangzhou. And upcoming, continuing our professional promotion, we have the utility safety competitions again. We used to have it every 5 years. So coming years, we will have the competition in Hong Kong and in mainland China, which will be held in Guangzhou City. There will be slogan competition on how to protect utilities or how to improve utility safeties. There will be drawing and BIN competition as well. And there will be practical competition this year, which is a 2-day camping in Guangzhou, China. And see our photos in the past. And this year, the competition is organized by IIUS, HKIUS, and the Pilot Committee of the mainland China. And also, we have Guangzhou Panyu Polytechnic as our main supporting organization. And the actual event will be held there as well. And you are welcome to take part and participate in this competition. And in the practical competition, you need to be real practical. So you need to take part. And locally, we have totally 52 organizations supporting the event, including majorly from the Development Bureau, from the HKSAR government, 11 other government departments, 8 local universities, and 32 international organizations. Meanwhile, we also have received sponsorship from 6 companies. And you are and your organization is welcome to take part as supporting organization in name or being a sponsorship in logos and flyers. And we thank to this organization, including the Indian Society for Changeless Technologies, and also the University of Texas, and the Purdue University and International Infrastructure Solutions as well. And you are welcome to join. And all this information can be downloaded from the IIUS website, which is www.iius.org.hk. We plan to have the event at the end of March 2021. Please take part, and we only welcome for graduates with less than 5 years experience. For those competitions to be held in Hong Kong, those are for students as a promotion. And in the practical competition, we have the quiz, we have the written test, we have the field survey, and we also have the presentation with report. Please join us by submitting the application form. Well, here's the awards. The champion, there will be a cash coupon equivalent to 20,000 Hong Kong dollars plus a certificate. The first runner-up, 10,000 Hong Kong dollar equivalent plus the certificate. The second runner-up, 5,000 Hong Kong dollar equivalent plus a certificate. And there will be merit for 1,000 Hong Kong dollar or equivalent plus a certificate. And then again, you are invited to join. Now we are calling for participation and sponsorship. Without you, we cannot survive. Welcome. More information you can download from the website, or you can scan the QR code as you can see from the screen. And we strive for improving the professional standard of utility specialist industry. I am King Wong, the Executive President of IIUS, the International Institute of Utility Specialists. You may call me from my mobile or contact me from my WeChat, or you can email me as well. Thank you for your time. and we wish you all good and healthy in the all long future. Thank you very much. I'm King Wong.